Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Legacies of Eugenics in New England Conference, Part 1. As we gather in this virtual space, we invite you to take a close look at this Founder's Tree 1921 tapestry created by Judy Dow, an Abenaki and French-Canadian artist and basket maker you'll hear from in a bit. You may recognize this as a representation of the now iconic image of the Second International Congress on Eugenics held in 1921. Here, Judy repeats the words of that image, and I'll read them. They're a bit small there. It says, "Eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution." And also, like a tree, eugenics draws materials from many sources and organizes them into an harmonious entity. On the next tapestry, slide we should see on the screen here, queuing up the second, there we go. This is called The Witness Tree of 2021, also a tapestry by Judy Dow. And it's Judy's vision of how we might reimagine the tree today and for the future. Her words are, "Anti-eugenics is the collective creation of an equitable and healthy world for all. Like a tree, anti-eugenics draws from many sources and transforms them into a one mind and one heart way of being." And we'll speak more about this image in future parts of the conference. But now we turn to Professor Evelynn Hammonds, the chair and the Barbara Gutman Rosencrantz Professor of History of Science, Professor of African and African American Studies, and the director of the Project on Race and Gender in Science and Medicine at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. That center being our conference host, for which we're deeply grateful. Professor Hammonds.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Evelynn Hammonds, and on behalf of Henry Louis Gates Jr. and the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research, it really is my great pleasure to welcome you today to this symposium on Legacies of Eugenics in New England. As the director of the Project on Race and Gender in Science and Medicine at the Hutchins Center, I could not be more invested in this topic than I am, and in Fair Harvard's role in eugenics. Today marks a century to the day that Henry Fairfield Osborn opened the Second International Eugenics Congress, speaking in front of an idealized statue sculpted from measurements of the, quote, 50 strongest men of Harvard, unquote, where he spoke about the decline of New England and the, quote, the extinction of the stock, which laid the foundations of the Republican institutions of this country, unquote. So I think it is fitting that we open today's symposium not only at Harvard, but at a Harvard institution that today represents almost everything Osborn would have stood against. We are calling this the anti-centennial for that reason. And it's important to note that as a university, as Adam Cohen has noted, Harvard was more central to eugenics than any other university. I think we all agree that now is the time for institutions across New England, including a number of the most elite institutions of higher learning, re-examine their historical role in the seeding and propagation of eugenics as a science, and work actively to acknowledge and repair the damage eugenical practices and ideologies have done. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the tremendous efforts of my colleagues in the New England Eugenics Legacies Reflection Group to put this meeting together: Charlene Galarneau, Mike Bryant, Natalie Koffler, Daniel Hosang, Hannah Marcus, Suzanne Preston-Blier, Nora Gross, and Benedict Ipgrave. It's been a real team effort, and I'm proud to be a part of this team. I'd also like to acknowledge the great behind the scenes work of the Hutchins Center events team, Matt Weinberg and Justin Snade, and the center's executive director, Abby Wolf. So again, I welcome you to this first day of Legacies of Eugenics in New England, and thank you for being here with us for these important conversations.
Thank you, Professor Hammonds. My name is Charlene Galarneau, and I am faculty at Harvard Medical School Center for Bioethics. I am also Vermont born, and Vermont is my home now once again. On behalf of the New England Eugenics Legacies Reflection Group, we are so pleased that you're joining us today for this part one of our conference. And we'll start with a bit of housekeeping. Today's program, as you can see, is ASL interpreted and with a live transcript available in English. If you wish to enable or disable the closed captioning on your screen, you can click the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. We will put relevant links into the chat as the program proceeds. We have a lot of programming to get to, but if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them as we are able. Now for some context to start. You may know that 100 years ago this month, the Second International Congress on Eugenics was held at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. You may not know that today, September 22nd, is 100 years to the day of the opening of that Congress in 1921. That event drew nearly 400 attendees, mostly from across the United States and England, with a few from across the globe. And starting next week, that 1921 Congress is being marked with a virtual 6-day dismantling eugenics convening. And you should be able to see that in the chat. That is having many exciting thought leaders, activists, poets, scholars, artists, and others doing presentations and readings and art. So we hope you'll join us there as well. A little more about us here. A year plus ago, the From Small Beginnings project at the University College of London, which you may recognize as the home of Sir Francis Galton, catalyzed multiple eugenics reflection groups across the United States and in multiple countries in order to deepen research and conversation about eugenics. This conference is the work of the New England Reflection Group, and we want to recognize Benedict Ipgrave of the University College of London and thank him for bringing us together. So thank you, Benedict. Today is part one of the 3-part New England Conference and focuses on eugenics in the past. Part 2 on October 19th will feature eugenics in the present, and part 3 on November 16th will look to eugenics of the future. And again, you'll see a link in the chat with more information on how to register for those. So each day will spotlight 4 New England contexts or communities that have complex and varied involvements with eugenics over time. Vermont, Harvard University, Yale University, and the deaf community. And the future 2 parts will each add 1 more community or theme. Each spotlight will be a 30-minute segment, and each conference day will end with a 30-minute collective discussion among several presenters, with a moderator who will start the discussion off with themes and insights from across the presentations. So please, if you can, stay with us today for that, beginning at 3:30 and ending at 4 o'clock Eastern Time. So before segueing into our first spotlight, that is the eugenics in Vermont, we wanted to begin this introductory segment exploring the theme of how we remember eugenics, attentive to who that we that's remembering is, and some of the many different ways of remembering. So in just a moment, historian Michael Bryant, professor at Bryant University in Smithfield, Rhode Island, will offer us a big picture view of Indigenous genocides and extinction theory, one way of remembering. I'll follow with a land acknowledgement, a very different way of remembering, after which Judy Dow will say a few words about the origins of land acknowledgements. And then in the Vermont program, we'll hear a bit about the Moccasin village model, a third approach to remembering eugenics created by Vermonters Judy Dow and Nancy Gallagher. So now I turn this over to Professor Michael Bryant.
Okay, can you hear me? I don't see my my video image on the screen. Okay, hold on just a second. There we are. Okay, Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with everybody today. I'm actually a Germanist by training, a scholar of German history, and I've been thinking a good deal as of late about the connections between the Nazi Holocaust, which is my area of specialty, and colonialism. There was a recent film that came out not long ago on HBO Max, as I recall. It's called Exterminate the Brutes. Some of you may have seen this, and when it came out last July, it really captured my interest and focused it on the linkages between these two events. The film itself is based upon a book written by Sven Lindqvist. Lindqvist argues in his book entitled Exterminate the Brutes that European colonialism and its associated ideologies lay at the heart of Nazi racial policies, because the driving force behind colonialism was land acquisition. European seizure of territories occupied by indigenous peoples required their removal. According to Lindqvist, European colonialism presupposed the erasure of indigenous peoples. And this required a kind of linguistic subterfuge able to justify colonialism as something other than what it clearly was, namely genocide and robbery. Scientific racism supplied the needed argot. In the writings of prominent Europeans and Euro-Americans, a discourse came into being that assumed indigenous peoples would be completely wiped out. Such a style of speaking and writing about native peoples, which a recent scholar, Patrick Brantlinger, has called extinction discourse, was common among Western colonial and cultural elites well into the 20th century. However, and by whomever used, extinction discourse assumed that indigenous peoples would sooner or later disappear and that their disappearance was inevitable. The birth of scientific racism in the mid-19th century invigorated extinction discourse. In the hands of scientific racists like Robert Knox, race became identified as the most important criterion of human value. As Knox himself wrote in 1850, and I quote, "Race or hereditary descent is everything. It stamps the man," unquote. From this principle, he deduced the inferiority of indigenous peoples and then went on to predict their eventual destruction. Within just a few decades of the beginnings of scientific racism, eugenics came into being. It quickly became a repository for scientific racial ideas of white supremacy and non-white inferiority, as well as the idea that the so-called darker races would be exterminated as an unavoidable result of progress. Extinction discourse, in short, would spread from scientific racism into eugenics. Today, I would like to propose that extinction discourse as a self-fulfilling prophecy of the demise of native peoples did not begin with scientific racism. Instead, it is already detectable in the attitudes of European colonists, including 17th century New England Puritans. Puritan settlement of New England, while it coincided roughly with the scientific revolution, was of course a stranger to scientific racial or eugenic attitudes toward Native Americans. The Puritan worldview was not scientific materialist, but theological and providential. As with scientific racism, however, the religious episteme of the Puritans provided a ready-made support for the land hunger of the colonists and the annihilation of the Indians. A type of extinction discourse appears in the writings of some of the leading figures in the New England colonies. We can discern it in the genocidal language of colonial military officers involved in the Pequot War of the 1630s. They justified their attack on the Pequot village in Connecticut, in which between 600 and 700 Pequot civilians were ambushed and killed, as sanctioned by scripture. Captain John Underhill, a commander in the assault, wrote that the Bible demanded that women and children, quote, "must perish with their parents. We had sufficient light from the word of God for our proceedings," unquote. Pilgrim leader William Bradford concurred, describing the destruction of the village as, quote, "a fearful fight to see the Pequots frying in the fire. The victory seemed a sweet sacrifice," unquote. Puritan commander Captain John Mason exalted in the violence as a divine act, a judgment falling upon, quote, "the heathen filling the place with dead bodies, unquote. Puritan minister Cotton Mather regarded the conflict in a similar light. Mather advocated extermination of native peoples to remove them as obstacles to spreading the gospel. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the idea that God would exterminate the Indians was revised under the impact of the Enlightenment. Now, extinction discourse was clothed in a new form. The source of their destruction was not God pursuing his purposes to spread Christianity, but the cause of progress in its march through the world. Both forms of extinction discourse serve the ends of territorial acquisition, in the one case justified by divine providence, and in the other by the Indians' supposed inability to cope with modernity. US expansion across North America advanced with the growth of scientific racism, and so did westward expansion in the colonial period, except it coincided not with scientific racism, but with a providential view of native peoples. What had begun as a theological rationalization of land theft and the destruction of the Indians would later be flexed to accommodate new rationales that were better suited to the beliefs of the age. The extinction discourse of the colonial and post-colonial periods later infiltrated the eugenics movement, providing a theory with deep roots in American history to legitimate further attacks and genocides. Whether for religious or secular reasons, the New Jerusalem would be built in the wilderness atop the bones of indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, I think, for that very both horrifying but powerful way of remembering. Now we're going to offer a very different way of remembering, our land acknowledgement for today. We gather to recognize the legacies of eugenics perpetrated on this land, now often called New England. We begin by recognizing and honoring the land itself. And because I am in southern Vermont, we recognize these lands as the traditional lands of the Sokoke people from the Algonquin linguistic group and the Wabanaki Nation, who have cared for this land for many generations. It's auspicious that today marks the fall equinox, the part of the annual cycle of life and death, a day when there is as much daylight as darkness, and when the sun rises and sets 12 hours apart and marks the end of summer and the start of autumn. That glorious fall light shines on the ancient rounded peaks to the west, lush with mixed hardwood forests growing up amidst the rocky till left by receding glaciers. Maples, oaks, beeches, and willows accompany the many creeks, which become streams and then rivers, flowing east into the great Connecticut River. Near here, below Mount Wintasticate, the wide boulder-strewn West River meets the Connecticut, and the adjacent flooded oxbow is home to bass and yellow perch, mallards, herons, grasses, and now purple asters. In these fall days, the abundant corn and tomatoes are dying back to the land, while apples burst forth and acorns drop and chipmunks scurry to store them. The turkeys, with their now not so small young, are scavenging the plowed fields and meadows. In the cooling air, the broadwing hawks, ruby-throated hummingbirds, and monarch butterflies have joined the warblers and others to head south for warmth and food. Saturn and Jupiter shine bright in the clear night skies, and the constellation Orion rises in the early morning darkness. We acknowledge these and the many other indigenous homelands within the land we call New England. We acknowledge the theft and destruction of these lands and the genocide of its native peoples by settler colonialists. And we begin our repair of this harm in some small way with our acknowledgement, our remembering, and our honoring of this land. So let's bring in Judy at this point, Judy Dow. because much of what I know about land acknowledgements comes from Judy, who, as I mentioned earlier, is an Abenaki and French-Canadian artist and basket maker. Let's see, do we have her coming in here?
Hello.
There we go.
For thousands of years.
Judy, I'm going to finish up this. Judy leads Gadakana, a Native American experiential outdoor education and leadership development organization, and you can see that link in the chat. And as an educator, Judy teaches many things, including land acknowledgements, their origins, and more. So Judy, please.
Thank you. For thousands of years, Indigenous people have honored the land as kin through land acknowledgements day in and day out. The relationships with the land is always honored, respected, and revered as a relationship that we have a responsibility to care for. With that responsibility comes an unwritten reciprocal agreement that we will have a responsibility, we will care for each other. Between 2007 and 2015, Canada worked with 6,500 boarding school survivors to uncover what was needed for them to heal. During the process, 94 statements were created, most involving the connection with land. The loss of language, sacred spaces, and ceremonies were on the top of the list to reclaim and connect with. Out of this convening came an agreement that people would honor the land and the people who cared for her in a land acknowledgement. This agreement was a way to recognize this beautiful land was stolen and that many profited from that theft. And it was a way to help Indigenous people heal from the atrocities that occurred to them. A land acknowledgement is an agreement to develop a relationship with the land as kin and to recognize what has been lost, and then learn how to properly care for the land. Slowly, over 5 or 6 years, the concept of a land acknowledgement crossed the border into the US. But some of the understandings was lost in its travel. Land acknowledgements are really to honor the land. The acknowledgement should be primarily about the land, and secondly, about the people who has cared for the land for generations. This should never be an I story, but a story of connection with land as the kin. Start with a self-reflection. Ask yourself, what is your place on this land? It is important to understand the long history that has brought you to this land and to seek an understanding of your place within this history, not to change the history of the land. Do your homework, research history, language, place names, the history of the land and the people that lived there over time. A land acknowledgement should come from the heart, and they should never be presented in the past tense only. Mother Earth is still here today. A land acknowledgement should not stand alone. There should be an action that accompanies it. Doing these things will allow you to build an honest, real, authentic relationship for developing a land acknowledgement. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you. So much there for us to learn from. Thank you. So as we move to Vermont, the first of the 4 communities that we will focus on today, let me also introduce Nancy Gallagher, who's now in the frame. Nancy is an educator, a historian, and the author of the book, Breeding Better Vermonters, the Eugenics Project in the Green Mountain State. Again, the link is in the chat. This is the definitive book on Vermont eugenics, published in 1999. And I just have to say, I've had the great pleasure over the last year of working with these 2 women in the work I've been doing on eugenics, and I feel very honored for that. Both of these women are longtime educators and researchers, and together they've greatly expanded eugenics research in Vermont. not to mention eugenics education. So today they're going to share with us for about the next half hour about the Eugenics Survey in Vermont, as well as weaving in their Moccasin Village model of research and remembering, a very innovative and interesting way of remembering eugenics. And so I will turn it over. I believe, Nancy, are you starting us off?
I am, and we have a PowerPoint too slide.
So a screen share.
Yep.
Let's see if we can get that enabled.
Okay. In 1995, I chose to write a history thesis on Eugenics Survey of Vermont, and in fact, the whole eugenics movement in Vermont. Over the previous year, I'd been investigating the connections between science, scientific research, state land use policy, and Vermont's cultivation of a celebrated identity, one that happens to endure today. The Eugenics Survey of Vermont, which went between 1925 to 1937, fell right at the conjunction of those trends. I was particularly intrigued by how a state that championed individual freedom and tolerance could interfere in the most intimate aspects of family life and reproduction. I was familiar with historian Kevin Dan's articles on the Eugenics Survey of Vermont and Henry Farnham Perkins, the University of Vermont zoology professor who began the survey in 1925 and used the studies to promote eugenics sterilization, notoriously Vermont's 1931 sterilization law. Until Kevin Dan's articles in 1987, 1991, Vermont's participation in the eugenics movement had largely been submerged and silenced. At the same time, the survey's most important publications, Rural Vermont, A Program for the Future, and We Americans, An Ethnic Study of Burlington, were considered classics in Vermont history courses. Yet in the early 1990s, the Missisquoi Band of Abnaki pointed to the Eugenics Survey of Vermont as an attempted genocide of its people. In the early 90s, American scientists had successfully disowned eugenics, claiming it had been rejected by scientists after 1930, or certainly after World War II, conveniently ignoring the fact that the new eugenics was taught in college biology and genetics courses well into the 1960s throughout America, and sociobiology still used many of the same techniques to discuss hypothetical genes for intelligence, altruism, and the like. Persons assumed to have hereditary conditions that predispose them to mental or physical disabilities continue to be discouraged from having children. However, historians of eugenics realize that eugenics throughout the world has really never disappeared. My goal was to contextualize the Eugenics Survey of Vermont within the broader American eugenics movement, and specifically within Vermont's culture and public policy. Breeding Better Vermonters is basically a biography of the Eugenics Survey of Vermont and Henry Farnham Perkins, its leader and director. I describe the trajectory of the Vermont eugenics movement, its influences, its research on Vermont families by social workers, and the use of its finding to promote legislation in the state, including sexual sterilization, through both propaganda and direct political action. My sources were traditional historical documents, primarily the Eugenics Survey archives, which is about 50 cartons, that's quite sizable, and public records. Eugenics in Vermont did not begin with the Harry Perkins' survey, nor did it end when the survey closed in 1937. Since 1912, leaders in Vermont state government, social work, and medicine had promoted eugenics. The state legislature had passed a law mandating sexual sterilization in 1912, which was vetoed by the governor. In 1915, the Vermont passed laws that established the State School for the Feeble-Minded in Brandon, Vermont, and passed the Child Welfare Law, which defined dependent and delinquent children and set up a process where local authorities could remove those children from their families and place them in state institutions. Naturally, the populations at the Brandon School and the Vermont Industrial School swelled as towns were able to relieve themselves of troubled youth and so-called charges on the town for poor relief. Poor families and families who had been forced to the margins of Vermont towns were broken up. The children lost all connection with their families, their heritage, and their homeland. The state also launched a central registry of those families, making them even more visible to authorities. In 1919, the Vermont Conference on Social Work started the Vermont Children's Aid Society, whose mission was to expand upon the state public welfare work in implementing the child welfare law. Their first field worker, Harriet Abbott, and its general secretary, Josephine Webster, worked with town authorities to locate dependent or neglected children, remove them from their families, place them in foster care or institutions, or place them up for adoption. After having broken up many families and removed the children from their parents and their homes, Harriet Abbott wrote the article True Stories of Vermont Children in 1920, and which was basically a litany against the parents of these children and the home conditions in which they lived. Many of the mothers of these kids were also placed in either Brandon, if determined to be feeble-minded, or in the women's reformatory if they were cohabitating with a man, not their husband, which was a crime in the 1920s. Most courts were very willing to follow her recommendations. Miss Abbott was particularly concerned with young sexually active women who she considered, quote, feeble-minded women of childbearing age. Harriet Abbott, along with other social workers in the Vermont Industrial School, began creating pedigree charts of their clients' families. Abbott had actually spent a summer in 1923 at the Eugenics Record Office in a class for social workers. In the early 1920s, Henry Perkins began teaching courses on heredity and eugenics at the University of Vermont. In 1925, he discovered the pedigrees begun by these social workers and saw an opportunity to co-opt the effort and become Vermont's resident eugenicist. He started the Eugenics Survey of Vermont in 1925 with private funding from a child welfare philanthropist and hired Harriet Abbott as the first field worker. Abbott brought all the records from the Vermont Children's Aid Society, and the Department of Charities and Corrections granted access to their institutional records as well. Perkins' advisory board consisted of academics, heads of the Vermont Departments of Health, Welfare, Corrections, Education, and state leaders in social work. He had a very enthusiastic following. The family studies conducted over the first 3 years followed the model used in American eugenics over the previous decade, like the Gallagher family by Henry Goddard and the Jukes and other families that often rural who lived in the margins of mainstream society. Harriet Abbott and other field workers created files on over 6,000 Vermonters and families they labeled Vermont's degenerate families. Of these, they focused on a few major kinship networks of French Indian ancestry surrounding the Winooski River intervale in Burlington for special attention. They extended those genealogies back several generations and geographically across New England and Quebec. They also calculated, and this was important in every study, they also calculated how much each family had cost the taxpayers for poor relief, incarceration, and institutionalization. I knew none of the descendants of these families personally who were classified as degenerate in the Eugenics Survey case files and publications. I only knew them as names on cards and on pedigree charts, and as, quote, the pirate family, gypsy family, and Huntington, Korea family described in the Eugenics Survey annual reports. I hope my book would provide a framework for those affected to tell the story. The Eugenics Survey published their findings through annual reports, roundtable discussions, public lectures, and press releases throughout the state, and gave Vermonters a new language to describe unwanted families in Vermont towns. Their campaign both legitimized and amplified any latent prejudice against French Indians and other marginalized groups, a phenomenon we unfortunately have witnessed in the past 5 years in America today. Their campaign also contrasted real Vermonters, those families of the elite, descendants of the old Yankee Protestant stocks, who should have many children, with those who should not reproduce their own kind, who were accused of having poor heredity. And these come right out of publications and files in the eugenics records and the Vermont Children's Aid Society reports. In 1927, Henry Perkins started the Vermont Commission on Country Life, in which the Eugenics Survey served as the Committee on the Human Factor, on the people of Vermont. 3 years of statewide surveys on Vermont towns and institutions were published in Rural Vermont, a program for the future. Perkins felt this was a centerpiece of the entire eugenics survey and should be used as models for town development across the state. Chapter 1 celebrates the people of Vermont as descendants of, quote, the old pioneer stock who had first settled in the state, ignoring the fact that French Canadians and Indigenous people lived there. The committee recommended that they should develop pride in their ancestry, culture, and history. The other Vermonters were discussed in a separate chapter called Care of the Handicapped. The recommendation, the state should strengthen their role in supervision through welfare districts, mental hygiene programs, and early detection of mental retardation in public schools. And Henry Perkins wrote a special addition to that, encouraging the implementation of the Vermont sterilization law, which had been passed that same year. After the book was published, I became acquainted with Native people whose families, lives, and happiness have been torn apart by eugenics. I met Judy in 2003 at a conference she was organizing called We Are Still Here for the Vermont Academy of Arts and Sciences. Together, we decided to embark on an entirely new approach to researching eugenics history. I am a descendant of the white colonial stocks who removed Native people from America. And Judy descends from Native French Canadian ancestry who lived in Vermont for generations, many, many generations. Our family histories were essentially those of the perpetrators and victims of eugenics. And there was a huge cultural divide between how we viewed and experienced American eugenics history. So we decided to work to build bridges across this divide, connecting archival sources that I used with the actual experience of those impacted by eugenics. We developed the Moccasin Village Project model, named after the North Burlington community where Judy's family was from. I'd never heard of Moccasin Village, nor had any of the local historians. Yet all the people who lived there always called it Moccasin Village. Thus, I began a new learning curve of understanding the impacts on families targeted by eugenicists and on the transgenerational trauma felt by those families today. Okay.
You good? Good afternoon. My name is Judy Dow. So we created this model, and this model helped me to share frustrations over things like common knowledge. Common knowledge can be tricky. Something everyone in a specific ethnic group may know is not considered common knowledge unless academia knows it. Nancy kept asking me, where did you get that? Or how do you know that? And I would quickly reply, well, everyone knows that. And Nancy would promptly tell me, no, everyone doesn't. I don't know that. This was a jumping off point for me to use resources that Nancy, as a student of history, would have never considered. This would have been a problem, but because of this model and the project, it helped us to put value to each other's sources. For example, while looking through the boxes of the historical records, eugenics records, we came across a family with the name Irish. To Nancy, this was someone targeted who was probably of Irish descent. Cultural markers was something I was fully aware of and taught Nancy to read. This family's cultural markers indicated French-Canadian heritage in every direction to me. After mapping where these families lived, we discovered this family lived in the German part of town, which incorrectly placed them in the Anderson's ethnic study records as German. You see, the French were the first to intermarry with one of the 7 Germans that had moved to Burlington in the early 1900s. However, changing their surnames to Irish was the way this family hid their French and Indian family line. It was a way to hide in plain sight and survive. Nancy introduced me to the eugenics records stored in Middlesex, Vermont, at the state's Vital Statistics Office. These records were the original records that validated family stories I'd heard for my entire life. She also introduced me to special collections at the University of Vermont. These two sources became the threads that tied my family history together. I had songs, stories, values, and crafts like baskets that told the story too, but these files were different. They confirmed so much for me. So we wove the two sets of resources together to reclaim the story. I grew up not knowing anything about the Vermont eugenics records. However, at the same time, I knew everything about it. I just didn't have a name. I was constantly reminded to care for myself, and as the oldest child, I needed to care for my sisters too. I was taught to come straight home from school and how to dodge the truant officer when we were at camp. I was always warned to be good, or I would be sent to week school, a reformatory school where children were placed when they were supposedly bad. As Burlington High School student, I was first introduced to We Americans, a book written by Ellen Anderson on the cleavage of an American city. It was a required reading in my junior year. I began to question the chapters in the book. I knew the people. I recognized families and friends. I knew the parts of town that Anderson described as dark and dingy. But my questions nagged at the teacher. She told me, "My dear, this is a textbook. You must believe a textbook." Well, I was not quite that gullible. So when Nancy introduced me to the records, I totally engulfed myself in them, decoding them every step of the way. I matched them with my family stories. It was important to me that Nancy see that they were not just my stories. So I brought her to the parts of town she had never seen before. We went to Moccasin Village, a community of 25 French Indian families living there together. Frenchtown, another mixed ethnic community, and to the mouth of the river where the next generation of French Indians lived. She saw the places she had only read about in the books. I introduced her to the families the books were written about. There was as steep a learning curve for Nancy as there was for me. Cultural markers that I could easily read off the folks we interviewed, Nancy never identified. Understanding the eugenics words and using archival records was new to me. It was a joint effort for both of us to continue learning. Mapping became the path to finding a balance in this story. GIS, Geographic Information Systems, became a way of life for us. We started mapping everything. These maps began to put the stories in order for us. We wanted to see where these targeted families lived. Looking for a pattern, we pinned every state archaeological report showing a native site in Burlington. We discovered patterns that the historical sites were focused on and exactly where the targeted families lived. Then I created another map showing where every family listed in the eugenics records came from in Burlington, the largest city in Vermont. Of the 6,000 names, approximately 5,000 came from Burlington, Colchester, and Winooski. The three cities that completely surround a 1,700-acre interval or floodplain. There were 5 main families, and they were all intermarried. The other 1,000 names came from prisons and other institutions. There was an inner circle with these 5 families. The files on these families are the most complete. The eugenicists went backwards and lateral on their pedigree charts to find additional relationships and places. But for the most part, these files were incomplete, and they became the outer circle that was to be researched at a later date. There were also families listed in the records that were there to show a positive family. As Nancy stated, the eugenics records focused on primarily 3 families that they called the Huntington Correa family, the Pirate family, and the Basket Makers. This map shows the location of the Huntington Correa family in the records, which was located in Colchester, just north of the Burlington families, however, still on the edge of the interval. The interval was an important part of where these families lived and why they lived there. The interval is a floodplain that floods every spring. These 5 families lived off the interval land, regularly burning it, hunting and fishing and gathering. Of the 23 related families on this map, all were diagnosed with Huntington's chorea without a medical report in the files. None of these families have Huntington chorea, a hereditary disease today. Huntington's chorea was a newly discovered disease at the time, and they wanted to prove they had a family within Vermont that had it. The pedigree charts for this family started at Cold Springs Harbor in New York and continued into Vermont. The charts became a gift to Henry Perkins, executive director of Vermont Eugenics Survey, from Harry Laughlin, director of the National Eugenics Records Office in Cold Spring Harbor. This was my family, and the files recorded stories of 623 people over many generations being hunted, institutionalized, and some sterilized simply because they believed this family had Huntington's chorea. This slide acknowledges the largest pirate family in the records. These people lived in sizable houseboats. They traveled on the lake while living off Lake Champlain. At Burlington, the lake was 12 miles wide. This family collected driftwood that they could sell as firewood. They fished and sold their fish in Burlington Harbor and adapted and survived living off the lake. They basically owned the water, forming a metaphorical net across the lake to New York, traveling to wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. When the law got too close in Vermont, they took to the lake and historical spots in New York. All of the sites they traveled to, I was able to connect with ancestral woodland sites. They were traveling the same ancient routes their ancestors had followed. The places pinned on this map came directly from the eugenics records in Middlesex, Vermont. This map reflects the places the so-called gypsies sold their baskets. The points on this map came from newspaper articles that announced when the gypsies came into town and when they left town. This became a system that was used to signal the folks living in the next town further up the route that the gypsies were returning. Over 200 newspaper articles mapped a distinct route of leaving Vermont in the fall and returning in the spring, often traveling straight to Canada to see their relatives first. Through this system, the basket makers were met at the edge of a community and escorted through town back to the other side of town. Most often they went to Hartford, Connecticut in the fall to sell and trade horses and work at the circus for the winter. The next map reflects points where children were sent to Virgin School because of truancy. Once again, the subjective system was set up. Those living geographically on the hill or in the elite section of Burlington had excused absences for the same things those living in the margins of town did not receive. In one report, the students living on the hill section of town asked for a week of excused absences to work at the annual Champlain Valley Fairgrounds. The absences were excused. On the other hand, a month later, someone living in a targeted community asked for a week of excused absences to go hunting during deer season for food for the family. His request was denied. These biases were reflected in every record we looked at, and every record confirmed the locations. This map was created by looking at the poor farm records. The work farms and the poor farmhouses were placed in Burlington where people went to work, were places in Burlington where people went to pay off their debts or live and work at the farms if they had no other place to go. The Vermont Children's Aid Society helped people living in Vermont with charitable donations like new shoes for children so they could go to school. However, they kept lists for all those they helped. And when Harriet Abbott changed jobs and went to work for Vermont Eugenics Survey, she took all of those lists with her. These lists became the beginning of the eugenics records.
For me, our journey together has been an essential part of owning the role people like me played in the American eugenics history and making those who were just names on cards and charts fully human. Burlington's North End, Winooski Intervale is for me now a place of family, community, and a way of life central to the history of Vermont. Whereas my book provided only a skeleton, Judy's family stories, and those of the descendants from the pirate and gypsy family, who I became acquainted with, made it whole. Our work together is what I will always remember about eugenics and its legacies.
This photo is of the Interville, my uncle, and their farm is in the background. This is the place I grew up and called home. This is also the place where eugenics lives. Thank you. I need to escape from here. Sorry.
We went off.
Should I begin?
Yes, I would like to introduce you if that's a possibility.
okay.
I forgot to print off the paper.
That's okay.
As we move, let's see. Judy here. So I guess we jump. Nancy, oh no, that's not till 2, sorry. A final note. If you want to learn more about the Vermont eugenics, Charlene Galarneau will present the Ethics of Vermont Eugenics Past and Present on October 6th, 2 weeks from this evening. This Vermont Humanities program will be virtual and is open to all, and I believe the link will be in the chat. From Vermont, we turn south and east to Harvard University and hand this over to Professor Evelynn Hammonds. Thank you.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating and so moving. And now we turn to looking at Harvard's eugenics past. And I think we have 3 short presentations, hopefully leaving a little time for some questions. And so I want to begin with Paul Lombardo from Georgia State University on the history of Harvard's on Harvard's eugenics, on Harvard, Harvard and eugenics, yes.
Okay. I'm not sure if I'm on. Thank you, Professor Hammond. I want to take very quickly the next few minutes to describe the reach of eugenic thought.
Professor Lombardo, really quickly, I'm sorry, you may have a post-it note over your camera.
Sorry, there we go. Thank you. I want to take the next few minutes to describe the reach of eugenics thought within the leadership, the faculty, and the students at Harvard from about the first decade of the 20th century until about the 1950s. My goal is to list some of the most important people who endorsed various parts of the eugenic ideology and give you a very quick impression of how much support it had at Harvard. While I don't intend for this to be some kind of roll call of evil, I will focus attention on some of the more troubling examples of what all these men, in this case they are all men, had to say about eugenics. So I'll start with the most prominent men at Harvard, its presidents. President Charles Eliot was an early supporter of eugenic research. He served as vice president of the First International Congress of Eugenics in 1912, and 2 years later was on the organizing committee of the First National Conference on Race Betterment. Eliot thought that the behaviors such as murder, robbery, forgery, and prostitution were all biological problems that could be solved by policies such as compulsory eugenic sterilization. Lawrence Lowell followed Eliot as Harvard president and was an even more involved member of the movement. He was vice president of the Immigration Restriction League, which had been founded by 3 Harvard graduates who were instrumental in the passage of the 1924 Immigration Restriction Act, which severely limited immigration by Italians and Jews and established quotas on eugenic grounds that remained part of US law for 40 years. Administrators like Eliot and Lowell were joined by several noteworthy leaders in the movement who were trained at Harvard or were members of the university faculty. The person who fit both those descriptions was Charles Benedict Davenport, who leads everyone's list as the most prominent person in American eugenics. Davenport received his BA, MA, and PhD from Harvard and taught there for 7 years in the late 19th century. His first book described how Francis Galton, who coined the term eugenics, applied statistics to ideas about heredity. His second book, even more successful, was Heredity in Relation to Eugenics. In 1910, Davenport founded the Eugenics Record Office in Cold Spring Harbor, New York. generally recognized as the epicenter of eugenics study and propaganda in the country. Davenport's Harvard students included people like geneticist W.E. Castle, who in 1906, with Davenport's encouragement, became a member of the Eugenics Committee of the American Breeders Association, one of the first formal eugenics organizations. Castle taught a course in genetics at Harvard for 20 years, eventually publishing his lecture notes for that course in a book entitled Genetics and Eugenics in 1916. Davenport also mentored psychologist and primatologist Robert Yerkes. While still a student at Harvard, Yerkes announced that he was developing a course in mental heredity and eugenics, which shall be of value to Harvard men and to the race. Yerkes became famous for the World War I alpha and beta testing program designed to identify the mentally unfit Army recruits. He spent 15 years on the Harvard faculty. Another geneticist, Edward Murray East, moved to Harvard in 1909. His book, Mankind at the Crossroads, complained about charity, quote, spent on imbeciles. He emphasized what he called the innate biological differences between whites and blacks and recommended racial separation to maintain white supremacy. Psychiatrist Elmer Southard received 3 degrees from Harvard and was on the faculty about 20 years. He was a member of the first board of scientific directors of the Eugenics Record Office, vice president of the First International Congress of Eugenics, and chair of the eugenics section of the American Breeders Association. There are many others, and I'm running through these quickly. Ophthalmologist Lucien Howe on the Harvard medical faculty supported sterilization of the blind. Psychologist William McDougall moved from London to Harvard and worked there for about 7 years in the 1920s. He too supported eugenic segregation and sterilization. And finally, anthropologist and criminologist Ernst Houghton was on the Harvard faculty from 1912 to 1954. One of his most famous books was Apes, Men, and Morons, in which he urged the elimination of, quote, the unfit, the worthless, the degenerate, the antisocial portions of each racial and ethnic strain. This short list describes only some of the Harvard people associated with eugenics, but I should say that eugenics was hardly an exclusive club. Similar lists could be put together from other Ivy League schools, most land-grant colleges and state universities, and a number of religiously oriented schools as well. We know that contemporary surveys identified approximately 400 institutions where eugenics was taught. I would venture to guess that a more searching examination today would identify twice that many. So the hard work that remains to be done is not merely to condemn this part of our past, but to analyze just what eugenics meant to each of the people who used that term to describe some part of their own policy preferences and worldview. Absent that kind of analysis, this sort of list making serves little historical purpose. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, our next speaker will be Professor Suzanne Blier from Harvard.
Thank you very much, Evelyn, and everyone. And I think that this is such an important event, and want to thank also Charlene and Nancy and Judy. I grew up in Burlington, Vermont, and knew the interval, and many of my ancestors were from Huntington. And so this is part of my own history. Many of them were here in Cambridge, Newtown from the very beginning. Presidents at Harvard, many of them left to Hartford, Connecticut, up the Connecticut River, and into the area around Burlington. I grew up in a eugenics family. I remember very clearly my mother taking me to meet Perkins' widow, where I had tea. It was very strange, and for a young girl, almost impossible to understand what was happening. And so much of this history is coming back to me as a kind of new discovery. I'm an art historian and architectural historian, and I focus mostly on the arts and architecture of Africa. So why am I interested and why am I here? In part because museums are key institutions for public learning. They play a significant role in cultural and educational power, and the narratives museums present can have a far-reaching, even devastating impact. The term eugenics comes from the Greek word meaning good birth. And if we think about the origins of the history of art, at least as it is often conveyed back to the Greeks and the Romans, this is part of the larger history of what is in play. We know about the histories of some of the museums, the American Museum of Natural History, for example, and Theodore Roosevelt's role in that. We also know that today Harvard's museums are in many ways segregated. And this is one of the issues that is, I think, of special concern for me. There's certainly heroes in this story. One of them would be Abby Rockefeller, who was on the chair of the board of directors at the Museum of Modern Art. And in the 1930s, they were exhibiting African, pre-Columbian, Native American arts alongside modern examples. So too, her son, Nelson Rockefeller, developed an enormous collection, which is now part of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But while we can speak to these great individuals and stories from this vantage point, there are other stories. Here in Boston and Harvard were late to the table on the desegregation of museums. And Bill and Bertha Thiel had wanted to give their collection to Harvard twice, as a matter of fact, with a fair amount of funding. And that was the reason I had originally moved up here, to help curate that. And that did not happen, but it's now part of the MFA collection at the in Boston, the Museum of Art. When I walk around Cambridge, and I've become incredibly active, I see things in a somewhat different way. I remember thinking about the history of the museums here, and then reading Adam Cohen's amazing article. And it struck a bell, and I thought, well, I'm wondering if eugenics is a piece of this, and then thought back to Perkins and Vermont and to the Fleming Museum, and how science and art are in many respects correlated. And I walk across the Elliott Bridge near the Cambridge Boathouse, and I think about him not only as president, but also his celebration of the Harvard classics, so-called Dr. Elliott's 5-foot shelf, and how still today the classics, as important as they are, seem as a core against which other things are evaluated. Or President Lowell and Lowell House, and on Brattle Street, nearby to where I live, the neo-colonial structures from the 20s and 30s, really celebrating the Mayflower history of this area, and think back to my own parentage and the role that they played in this. My grandmother, one of them was a social worker. She studied at Smith and married a Harvard grad and law school student, and she became a core member of the Vermont Children's Aid Society, as did my other grandmother. And I can remember, be good or you'll end up in weak school was the common mantra, even as I was growing up. But I also think that this is a time when we're really looking deeply and thinking about the issues. I'm thinking about Oliver Wendell Holmes and the phrase Boston Brahmin and what it carried from the vantage point of heredity and related issues on social class. I'm thinking of Frank Tausig's Principles of Economics, and somehow the idea that everyone is making it on their own through good genes. And I think museums can play a critical role in this. My most favorite work in the Harvard Art Museum was a gift from Abby Rockefeller, a Benin bronze head, which carries the Rockefeller patina, as well as the bronze itself. She had given it with the idea in the 1960s that Harvard would desegregate its museum collections, and they had chosen then not to do it. I'm hopeful, because I tend to be an optimist on these things, that things will happen in a positive way. But I also reflect back on January 6th, on white nationalism, on race replacement theory, on the anti-abortion movement, and what that may mean about what particular populations are being encouraged to produce, and issues around immigration. And think to the real, people who have made important interventions, from Henry Louis Gates to many of the people here, to the Thiels, to the Rockefellers, other schools like Yale and Princeton and Dartmouth that have done great work in their collections, and think about how important these museums are in celebrating and fashioning a set of beliefs about who really should be in a particular place. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. And now we turn to Christopher Willoughby, who's a fellow at the Warren Center at Harvard this year, who will speak to us about eugenics and the Harvard Medical School.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. And I wanted to briefly talk to you for the next 4 or 5 minutes about an evolution, kind of the era that leads into Harvard's eugenics moment in the 19th century at the medical school. What I'll unpack is how by the eugenics era, and even at the end of my talk, we'll kind of be bleeding into that, Harvard's medical school already had a well-developed curriculum about race that had coalesced around essentialist beliefs about anatomy. Likewise, eugenicists at Harvard and elsewhere were building upon this longer trajectory. Specifically, I'm going to relate 3 episodes about the rise of skull measuring as a metric for intelligence in the 19th century. First, I will begin with Benjamin Waterhouse. In 1805, Waterhouse was a professor of medicine and natural history at Harvard, and he gave a lecture on the great chain of being and gradations of man to his students. Waterhouse's lecture borrowed heavily from the Dutch anatomist Petrus Camper, who pioneered the measurement of facial angles as a means to understand intelligence. He also relied on the work of Charles White, a British surgeon, who wrote a 1799 book supporting the notion that each race was a different species and Black people in particular were on the bottom of that hierarchy. Waterhouse quoted White at length to his students in favor of the notion that Black people were an inferior species based on their facial angle. Yet, it's worth noting at the end of the lecture, Waterhouse qualified his support for the new science. He feared it could be, quote, twisted to an evil purpose, end quote. In our first episode then in 1805, we see the introduction of essentialist racial thinking at Harvard's medical school. This was only a little more than 20 years after the school's founding, and Waterhouse, it's worth recalling, was a co-founder. In the second brief episode, I want to move on to the next generation through an overview of the skull collecting of John Collins Warren, adjunct and then full professor of anatomy at Harvard from 1809 to 1847. He was the son of founding anatomy professor John Warren. In the story of John Collins Warren, we see the evolution of racial science at HMS from guarded asides like Waterhouse to creating museum collections. By the time he had retired, Warren had collected 66 human crania, many originals and some casts that were organized into 5 racial groups. He also bought a skull collection from the Boston Phrenological Society, and using his own funds, he donated both along with thousands of non-racialized anatomical objects to Harvard. These were the basis of the Warren Anatomical Museum. Warren's own musings tell us that he thought Black people were likely a separate inferior species. He also believed Native Americans comprised 2 species, one inferior and local to the United States in Warren's own time. On the other hand, the quote unquote Peruvians had since disappeared according to Warren. He believed they were related to South Asians, and they were exclusively responsible for all kind of historical civilizations, in particular architecture in the Americas. He even gave a paper to this effect at an academic conference in Britain. We also have good reason to believe that this entered his pedagogy, as a colleague noted that he had heard that Warren taught his students that Black people had longer arms than whites. Episode 3 begins with Warren's retirement and replacement by Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. Unlike Warren, Holmes left undetailed but clear notes for his anatomy lectures. And thus we can actually say what medical students were taught at Harvard. And this is during that transition from the polygenesis era to the beginning of the eugenics era in racial science. Like Warren, Holmes had a long career as the school's anatomy professor, spanning from 1847 to his retirement in 1882. During that period, we have records of Holmes's lectures during 10 sessions that spanned his career. In those 10 preserved sessions or academic years, Holmes devoted at least 1 lecture to racial difference, and in particular skull measuring. In the 1850-51 session, he discussed modes of examining crania, such as facial angles. He also cited Samuel Morton and Louis Agassiz, another Harvard proto-eugenicist, we might say. In 1880, the last session we have records for, Holmes devoted 1 lecture to the mechanism of the skull, including orthognathoous and prognathoous skulls. He also gave some hints on phrenology. So to summarize, beginning in the first decade of the 19th century, founding faculty member Benjamin Waterhouse had begun to discuss skull measuring and race as a part of the curriculum. During the first half of the 19th century, Harvard faculty member John Collins Warren assembled a formidable scroll collection for just this purpose. Finally, his successor, Oliver Wendell Holmes, routinely taught his students how to measure skulls for intelligence and racial purposes. This brief history reminds us that in many ways, eugenicists were building upon the work and pedagogy of 19th century racial science. Moreover, it reveals how this type of science has a deep history at Harvard and in US medical education broadly. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And now we have time for just a few questions for Chris, for Suzanne, and for Paul. And I'd like to start with Paul. Paul, you name about, I think by counting the list that you presented us, about 10, 15 different members of the Harvard community who were involved in eugenics at all levels. But could you say something more about how long you think this, either the formal activities or informally association with eugenics ideas persisted on the faculty and in the administration?
Well, I used Houghton as the last example because I think his dates go the furthest. He goes up into 54. But it would take a fairly close examination of curriculum at Harvard and anywhere else, frankly, to find out how long this lasted. There were textbooks, well-used textbooks in biology and psychology, for example, that were used well into the late 1960s, which had the pictures of the Calicacs and the Jukes and the usual kind of problem family information. I can't say with any certainty because I've not done that kind of deep dive into the curriculum, but I'd say it wouldn't be surprising if I saw it all the way into the 1970s. And of course, what I'm talking about is a very explicit hereditarian bent tied to the other issues that people have been talking about, whether it be race or immigration or disability.
Thank you. Suzanne, the question I have for you is you tell us this very interesting story of the Teals trying to give their collection to Harvard. But could you say more about the kinds, they obviously were rebuffed, but can you say more about what the conversation might have been, or how they at least interpreted the conversation around why their collection was resisted?
That's a great question, and I certainly had spoken with them a fair amount about it, and you know, they were very polite and thoughtful, and it ended up at the MFA Boston. But I think that part of one can always use the issue of space, right? And we don't have personnel, and there are lots of things in place, but it did come with some curatorial funding linked in with it. But I think it was largely, we've got this taxonomic issue. Certain objects belong in one place and certain objects belong in another place. It's a little bit like, I love the connecting with the GIS mapping in Burlington. It's like certain groups should be living on the interval and certain others in another place. And I think the creation of a scientific base for some of this pseudoscientific in the late 19th, early 20th century sort of drove this in part with the MFA Boston turning over to Harvard Native American baskets, because at that time they were seen not to be, you know, viable art. And so we've got this kind of framing of what it should be in one place and not in another place, I think almost from the outset.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And here's a question for Chris. So we have 3 episodes. You have skull measuring with Waterhouse. You have a continuation of that set of practices. Do you want to say more about Holmes, for example? He was both a practicing physician, but he was also dean of the medical school.
Yeah, and Holmes, I think, is also someone who, outside of a kind of infamous speech he gave in the 1850s about Native Americans, who has largely stayed out of this history to some extent, but he's also the one we have the most clear evidence on about teaching and pedagogy. Holmes, in that 1850-51 session, that was the year Martin Delaney and 2 other African-American students attended Harvard briefly. We think it's kind of unclear in the records actually how long they stayed, but that's also the year that Holmes gave the most lectures on racial science to his students, 3. Usually it was 1, maybe 2. And this is something that persists throughout his career. There are random gaps in the archive, but he continually teaches skull measuring. And it's very clear that he's teaching a methodology. And we also have evidence, pretty strong evidence that Holmes likely brought the skulls that Warren collected into the classroom, taught students on these skulls how to measure. So in some ways, every Harvard graduate had the potential to be their own eugenicist if they worked under Holmes, their own skull measurer. So I think that's one of the really critical takeaways from looking at somebody like Holmes, who's not a published eugenicist, a published really polygenicist. There are quotes you can find if you really dig, but is that he was not ostensibly a part of this movement in any known way, but he might have influenced more eugenicists, more racial scientists than somebody like, say, Josiah Knott, who's a very famous polygenist, through 40 years of instructing hundreds of students a year, or 100 to hundreds at Harvard.
Thank you. Okay, Suzanne, there's a question for you. Did you see that one in the Q&A?
I did. It's interesting. It takes me back.
So the question came in back in the 1990s. A great old Yale architectural historian named George Hersey remarked to me that although the infamous naked posture photos had no scientific value, they might have value to a historian of art. Has anyone ever picked up on that?
I haven't heard that one has picked up on that, but it's an interesting thing because bodies are simply not sort of limp, right? One is fashioning them, one is modeling them in particular poses. And we know from books such as Karl Heinrich Straat's that in that context, Europeans were posed in the forms of European art, and Africans, Native Americans, Asians were posed in a manner that was seemingly more sort of sexualized. So I would be curious as to how the posing was done. It's always an interesting one. It goes back to the famous models for the 1893 Columbian exhibit that were also on view in the Harvard gym. I can't imagine being a student and seeing those and imagining every time you walk by how delinquent your parents were in providing you with the genetic makeup to conform with those ideals.
Right, right. So thank you. I think, do we have time for one more question, Matt?
Yes, you do.
Okay. So Paul, you talked about, we're here to speak about Harvard, but could you sort of maybe give us your perception? This may not be a fair question, but on how extensive this kind of participation in eugenics activities was in some of the other New England colleges that you might know about?
Well, it's clear that Yale, I mean, you've got somebody coming on to talk about Yale, but Yale had a very thorough involvement as well. I've seen, I don't have a list in front of me, but Cornell certainly did, Columbia did, Princeton did. You can go to all of the, certainly all the Ivies, and for that matter, the rest of the state universities at that time, and find, if not individuals who are prominent, certainly curriculum that is thoroughly ensconced.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you. Thanks to all three of you for really insightful reports. I am deeply struck by the conversation, the presentation by Suzanne, my colleague and friend, about in ways in which sort of aspects of eugenical ideology is actually literally in the landscape in Cambridge and around Harvard Yard and around other parts of the university. And that is that's very striking to me. I think I want to pay much more attention as I'm walking around the square to those issues. And thank you, Chris, for the wonderful work you've been doing at Harvard Medical School, the history of Harvard Medical School, and the work on the skulls and the other human remains and the anatomical and anatomical education at the medical school. So thanks to the three of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Professor Hammonds, for putting together such a fascinating group to talk about both public and elite education in so many ways around eugenics. I think we're going to move on to the next session now. I think we've got a little bit of setup to do with this. This is going to be about Alexander Graham Bell, Gallaudet University, eugenics and the deaf community. And I believe, are we set there? It looks like we are. This session will be chaired by Professor Brian Greenwald, a historian at Gallaudet University. Welcome, Professor Greenwald.
Thank you. Can everyone see me clearly? It's an honor to be here with all of you this afternoon. So what does it mean for eugenics? We're talking about the legacy of eugenics at Harvard University and the impact that it has had on the American deaf community as well. In the deaf community, deaf people have had deep conversations about eugenics and about deaf marriage rights, having children. The ideas of eugenics, the ideologies of eugenics in deaf schools all over America and at Gallaudet University. Eugenics was popular, and then it went from Harvard to other universities such as Gallaudet. The most prominent deaf organization is the National Association for the Deaf, NAD. And that association was founded in 1880, and there was a lot of in-depth conversation about eugenics within that organization, and watching sterilization laws in the United States. So we see that kind of dialogue prevalent throughout the deaf community. Today we have two presenters, and we're going to look at how the greater narrative of our deaf community often starts with Gallaudet and Laurent Clerc. And Meredith Peruzzi is going to start. Can we get Meredith up on the screen? Oh, we're going to start with Nora? Okay. We will follow the program and start with Nora.
Okay.
We could spotlight her.
Okay. Happy to start.
Sorry, I thought we were going to start with Gallaudet and Laurent Clerc.
Oh, is that my baby? Oh,
Can
hi.
everyone see me?
I'm happy to start with the other way around with Meredith, if that would be preferable.
There is no preference.
Okay, then let me start. I have a few slides that I'll just ask slide to move on, and more just as a slide, as a background slide. It's a break from watching people staring straight into the screen. I'm going to be talking about Alexander Graham Bell and the Martha's Vineyard deaf community. I should preface this by saying that the issue of eugenics is something that I come across very regularly. My job now is I work on global disability issues in global health and international development. And on a very regular basis, I deal with ministers of health or people in the United Nations or health officials working in remote areas of Africa or Asia who still very much buy into eugenics models, whether they call it eugenics or not. So it's always interesting to me to be aware. Those are very nice slides, but they're not my slides. In any case, let me continue. It's always interesting to me that I also know some of the beginnings of this issue of eugenics, as well as seeing the daily continuing outcome of ideas that started over 150 years ago. In the late 1970s, I was a graduate student in anthropology in the PhD program looking at, or I should say, I stumbled across the fact that Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts had a very high rate of hereditary deafness. And over about 4 years from the late 1970s to the early 1980s, I undertook a study of that community as part of my PhD thesis. Very briefly, the deaf community on Martha's Vineyard, and I collected this data, I should say. It was like an oral history of a genetic disorder. I interviewed over 100 islanders. I looked at all available records, and I pieced together a history of an island where there was a small and then a growing community many of whom could trace their heritage to a small collection of towns in rural Kent, in the British county of Kent, about 60 miles outside of London. And if you could go to the second slide, that would be great. Over from about the first deaf person was noted to be on Martha's Vineyard in 1694. The last deaf woman died in 1952. Because it was a small community, because this community was already, people were already related before they arrived on the island and then continued to intermarry, there was a trait, a genetic trait for hereditary deafness, recessively inherited profound deafness at birth, that continued to rise in the population as the intermarriage continued up until the mid-19th century. By the mid-19th century, 1 in every 2,300 Americans on the mainland were deaf. On Martha's Vineyard, 1 in every 155 people were born deaf. And in Up Island, in some communities like Tisbury and Chilmark, 1 in every 49 people were born deaf. The remarkable thing was not that there was a high rate of hereditary deafness, but also that the islanders, being practical Yankees, adapted to the deafness by becoming bilingual, in English and sign language. So most people who were hearing could speak the local sign language, which was a mixture of the initially an English-based sign language, and I believe later on a combination of American Sign Language or French Sign Language and the earlier English Sign Language. And the question becomes then, how well did people who are deaf fare in a community where everybody could speak sign language? And it looked from the research I did that most people on the vineyard who were deaf fared exactly the same as their hearing relatives, neighbors, fellow townsmen. And there was really very little barriers, no barriers that I could discern between the deaf people who were deaf and people who were hearing. So there was intermixing on a daily basis. There was intermarriage on a daily basis. And if you looked at a lot of the records, it was really hard. People who were deaf made the same amount of money. There was limited professional opportunities. You could be a fisherman or a farmer, but people who were deaf owned the same amount of land, made the same amount of money. They participated in civic society in the same way. So it really was kind of in many ways an idyllic or model community of how disability can be incorporated into a greater society if the broader society adapts slightly to ensure everybody is included. In the course of doing this research, I came across, not initially, but as I got further into the research, the fact that someone else had tried to put together a history of this community earlier on. I was told initially he was a professor from Harvard, but it turned out to be a professor from Boston University. Actually, if you could go to the next slide. And he was collecting, he was doing much the same thing as I was doing only 100 years earlier. he was talking to the old timers and collecting genealogies. It turned out to be a professor named Alexander Graham Bell. Actually, I don't think he was a full professor at the time. He, in fact, was a young academic. He was in his late 20s. He was also tinkering around with a new invention called the telephone in about the same years. And he went on to use some of the vineyard records that he collected to help him frame and become involved in the American eugenics movement, take a good deal of leadership in the American eugenics movement. Ironically, he got two things about the research he collected on the vineyard wrong. One was that he didn't understand recessively inherited deafness. He understood dominantly inherited deafness, but recessive deafness left him bewildered. It was not a concept that was widely known at the time. And he also completely overlooked the fact that the vineyarders who he interviewed, and he spoke signs, so he should have picked up on this, I think. He overlooked the fact that the vineyarders who are deaf on the island were very much part of the community, and that they were not being excluded because they spoke sign language. Nonetheless, using kind of ignoring what to me was glaringly obvious examples of what was going on Martha's Vineyard in the 1880s. Bell went on. Could I put next slide, please? Bell went on to become a real voice and force in the American eugenics movement, and also to become very involved in encouraging deaf people to not marry other deaf people, but to try to marry either hearing people, or if they married deaf people, to decide not to have children. He was also very instrumental in things like that. There's a picture of the Congress of Milan, where the oralism school really prevailed on trying to get sign language instruction out of schools for the deaf. And in fact, he was, because he was so famous in his work with the telephone, he had a very strong voice in the eugenics movement in a way that if he had been just a professor of vocal physiology, if he'd remained at Boston University, he probably would not have. It would be analogous to someone like Bill Gates, coming down very hard and pushing a particular scientific theory today, even if it was outside his field. His encouragement of eugenics had an impact on the deaf community specifically, and more widely on people with disabilities, with a range of disabilities, over the course of well, it reverberates today in the disability community, although the deaf community has kind of had a much more, I think, sophisticated and nuanced approach and understanding to Bell's work over the intervening years, which I won't go into it. I believe the next speaker will address that to some degree, so I won't go into it here. I would also recommend the really good book by Katie Booth, The Invention of Miracles, which came out recently about Bell. Last slide, please. So there's a continuing legacy of the Martha's Vineyard deaf community that I would argue. On Martha's Vineyard itself, when I did the work in the late 1970s, early 1980s, the community had almost, the deaf community had been almost entirely forgotten, but there's been a revival of interest in the deaf community, and it's now considered very much part of the heritage on the island, and also part of the American Deaf Society's heritage as well. In terms of their memory of Bell, Bell isn't well remembered on the island itself, but the points that Bell took from the island that seemed to confirm his pre-existing prejudices towards eugenics continue to reverberate today, as many people with disabilities in countries around the world are still dealing with issues like marriage, intermarriage, access to resources, the right to speak for themselves and to represent themselves. I'd like to point out the recent pandemic is a good example in terms of where do you put resources when people with disabilities have to compete with non-disabled people for things like medical care. Here in the United Kingdom, of the people who died during COVID, 59% were people with disabilities, although they don't make up only 12 to 14% of the population. That to me is a striking example of the issues that still live in terms of concerns about eugenics and decision making. Many of the people who died in the recent COVID epidemic were people who were not necessarily in ill health, but when it came to deciding who got resources, the legacy of eugenics and approaches towards people with disabilities that came about in part through Bell's work continue to live today. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Gross. And apologies, I did forget to introduce the presenters. So we just had Professor Nora Gross, and she is at the UCL, University College of London. And then we have Meredith Peruzzi. She is the director of the National Deaf Living Museum at Gallaudet University. And she is going to speak about Gallaudet and Clare and the deaf community and the narrative there. Well, thank you, Brian. Thank you for the introduction. I would like to share a story about growth and not about destruction of a community, but the growth of the deaf community in New England. Beginning in the 19th century, there were deaf families in the Hartford area, Hartford, Connecticut. And they collected money to send Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet to Europe so that he could learn how to teach deaf children, because at the time, they only had one brief interaction with a deaf educator in the United States. People didn't know what to do with deaf children at the time. So Gallaudet did go to England and then to France. And in France, he met Laurent Clare. And at the time when they met, Clare was a deaf teacher at the Paris School for the Deaf, and they came to an agreement that Clare would come to America with Gallaudet and would teach, not how to teach, but would teach Gallaudet how to establish a school and teach deaf children at the time. So again, in New England, we are home to the first school for the deaf where there was formal education for deaf children. Initially, when the school opened in 1817, there were 7 students at the school, and the average age was 19. And that included children and a 50-year-old man named John Brewster. There is a famous portrait in the Connecticut area of Mr. Brewster. He was born deaf, and he used gestures and writing to communicate. He was a portrait painter, and he at the time, students at the school were mostly in the New England area, mostly from the Hartford area, and also from New England. And there were students that came from Martha's Vineyard to the American School for the Deaf. And They came from New Hampshire, they came from Maine, and there were these regional deaf communities in all the different states. And they did have their own sign systems at the time. For example, Martha's Vineyard Sign Language. That was the local sign system that was grassroots because there was a large population of deaf people in that area. So each state had that kind of area, and there was generational deafness, and their sign language was passed along. So Gallaudet and Claire used French Sign Language, and they worked together to establish a formal sign language. There were various influences, but they did create a formal national sign language in America. Now, during the 19th century, there were more schools for the deaf coming up after the first school was established. And many of those teachers went to Hartford to learn sign language and to learn pedagogy of teaching deaf children. And Clark did go around to various schools and train their teachers. At the time, there wasn't a established pedagogy. So Claire went around and taught at various schools. And this was before the Milan Conference of 1880. And that's where you started to see less signing because it was prohibited. And you saw an increase of oralism after the Milan Conference. But we're talking about before that. There were a lot of deaf teachers who learned their methods from the school in Hartford,
The piece
Connecticut.
I want to share today is from the archives of Robert Mearns.
And ASL is a natural language that deaf use. And as any language, it does evolve over time. So various people came from all over New England. They needed to communicate just like any other language would develop. And there's a need for communication. And so that's where you saw the beginning of American Sign Language in Hartford with a native deaf community throughout New England, coming from throughout New England. So if those communities were destroyed before we were able to establish American Sign Language, then it would have been a very different experience today. And my signing would probably look completely different. So there was a native organic growth of language. Thank you, Meredith. So now we have some questions and some discussion. Both Professor Gross and Meredith Peruzzi, their presentations truly show some ways of how things were happening in New England with the growth of the American deaf community and then the eugenics movement affecting that. When the American School for the Deaf was founded in Hartford, Connecticut, it was not that far from Boston. And A.G. Bell was in Boston. He had moved to Canada and then moved to Boston from there. He went from Scotland to Canada to Boston. And he lived with a family of the first students that were taught. And the boy's name was George Sanders. Bell lived with the family of George Sanders, and Bell himself also taught at Boston University before it was even called Boston University. He taught there. So he was really ingrained in the Boston community. So I'm thinking about your comments and how this fits into the whole narrative, the greater narrative of the deaf community, right? there are many generations of deaf students who have learned that history, that the community started in Martha's Vineyard, and that is a long-standing story in the deaf community that's passed on. And that a lot of students from Martha's Vineyard then went to Hartford, which is now the American School for the Deaf. So I guess my first question, well, first, I'd like to start in general with, I'm thinking about Laurent Clair. He married a deaf woman. He married Eliza Bairdman. And starting that conversation, Gallaudet and Claire were having a conversation, and the first response Claire had to Gallaudet's question about marriage, he said, I need to marry a hearing woman. But then he did marry Eliza, who was a former student and was deaf. So how do you think that discussion affected the deaf community in general? You mean the conversation on the ship? Yes, the conversation about deaf marriage, whether you should marry a deaf person or a hearing person. Meredith, well, I think at that time there was an influence of the general community and societal idea. It wasn't labeled eugenics at the time, but many deaf people did not have an idea about being genetically deaf. Laurent Clair, I believe, didn't become deaf until the age of 5, so it did not have a genetic predisposition to that. So I guess at the time it was pretty natural to marry a hearing person. So within the growth of the community, maybe people felt that, well, you know, it's more of a natural decision for me to now marry a deaf person, since I am a part of that community and that person would be as well. And a lot of people did not necessarily have awareness of the complicated issues related to why you should or should not marry a deaf person. But there was an influence from society in general in conversations in mainstream society. A lot of people would be limited because they wouldn't have access to hearing conversations unless they married a hearing person. I see Nora has her hand up.
Did I this response is an excellent one. I would only add, from my perspective, something like Martha's Vineyard was a remote community. I don't think it played, I think that there was a very active deaf community throughout Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont. I think the people who came from Martha's Vineyard were one example of a community where deafness existed for a long time, and the bilingualism was something that was unique in Martha's Vineyard. But my impression is that there was a very vibrant group of deaf individuals, the deaf community, that started to, as soon as the American school started to exist for a couple of years, they started to come in place around places like Hartford, Connecticut, and they were really an autonomous, self-supporting, they communicated with other people, other deaf communities throughout the United States. So this was a really vibrant community in itself. So I think when decisions like marriage came along, I think that people looked around and said, who do we know, who do we like? And I think that those decisions often would, you know, if we married, would it be a disadvantage to marry another deaf person, was often less of an issue than what right do we have as deaf people to have a full and fulfilling life. And I think the stronger the deaf community grew in New England and the rest of the United States, the more deaf people decided we're going to marry who we want, and we want this decision to be ours. So I'm not sure if Meredith would agree, but But again, I've been very impressed with the strength of the deaf community from the 1830s, 1840s. You really have a really vibrant group of people, and they kept in close touch. They wrote back and forth. There was newspapers. There was the American Annals of the Deaf. Now it used to be the American Annals of the Deaf and Dumb, but you read now it's the American Annals of the Deaf. It used to be the American Annals of the Deaf and Dumb. You read the early volumes of that, and it's really just kind of a lot of stuff going on within a community, and a really vibrant community informing itself of what's going on.
I think we have 3 minutes left. And I just want to take the opportunity to answer any questions that you feel free, to ask questions of me or Meredith or Professor Gross. A.G. Bell is most famous he was talking about, I need to ask him to repeat. His famous speech, polemic speech at the time, he invited the National Academy of Science because he was creating the phone. There was an audience, and he wasn't talking about the phone, he was talking about hereditary deafness. And that presentation was at the University of New Haven. And then he went to Martha's Vineyard afterwards to study for 4 years to study the generational deafness there. And he collected data. And what he did with that, what did he do with that data?
I can answer that. He never wrote it up. I've seen all the notes that he collected. And I went through it when I did my PhD dissertation. But again, one of the reasons I think he stopped somewhere in the midst of writing it up was he didn't understand why only 1 in every 4 children of deaf parents were themselves deaf. He didn't understand, he couldn't understand the pattern of recessive inheritance. And I think that's one of the reasons why he stopped and didn't write it up. And also because he went on to talk more broadly about eugenics. And I don't think that the data from Martha's Vineyard was supporting a lot of the statements he wanted to make about eugenics. So I reviewed all that data, and I wrote a book called Everyone Here Spoke Sign Language some years ago, and I covered as much of the data. I present a lot of the data in that or in my PhD dissertation, which is one of these long, lugubrious PhD dissertations. So nobody needs to read that, but the data itself doesn't show what Bell was hoping to show, which was clear patterns of inheritance. They do to us now because we understand recessive inheritance, but to Bell, he couldn't see a pattern, and I think that's why he didn't follow through with the vineyard data.
Okay, thank you both. I know our time has run out, so I'm going to turn it over to Charlene.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Greenwald. What a great group. I know that we all learned a lot in this last half hour. Thank you. We're going to move back to sort of an elite institutional context now. We're going to go to Yale University with Daniel Hosang, Professor of Ethnicity, Race, and Migration in American Studies at Yale University. Daniel, over to you.
Okay. Thanks so much, Charlene. Thank you, everyone. Gosh, I've learned so much in these last couple hours. I'm just so grateful to all the labor, the conference organizers, the sponsors, everyone who's done this work, and so appreciate its collaborative nature. I'm going to talk for just a couple of minutes at the beginning to give you a little bit of a sense of kind of Yale's point of entry into the story. And then I'm going to turn it over to 3 wonderful undergraduate students who spent a good part of their summer in special collections here at Yale to try to understand and relate to and make sense of the deep and really, really profound history of eugenics research and advocacy here. So I just have a couple of slides at the beginning, and then I'm really looking forward to introducing them. And this is a wonderful graphic that they came up with. I'll ask them to show you, to talk about it a little bit more, that kind of superimposes this image of the tree that we've been talking about since the beginning, and thinking about also the tree of connections and relationships that bound together so many scholars in the early 20th century at Yale around this project. So we'll come back to this. So what we're looking at now is a historic postcard for those of you who have spent time in New Haven, of the New Haven Green, 1919. So this is just before that second International Congress on eugenics that we heard about at the start. And if you look right ahead of our kind of eye line there, you'll see a building that a professor at Yale, Irving Fisher, at some point during this time must have had his eye on, because Professor Irving Fisher attended that 1919 conference. He's an economics professor at Yale. We'll hear more about him. And fascinated by the depth and breadth of the research happening there, and said, we need an organization, an institution committed particularly to public education. How are we going to educate the public about this new science and bring them in to its projects to help them understand its far-reaching policy potentials? And this was the birth of the American Eugenics Society, and its founding actually in New Haven. So from 1921, they spent a couple of years getting it off the ground, and in 1926, it gets incorporated, and its first headquarters are at 185 Church Street in New Haven. The building itself doesn't exist anymore, but that's where we would see it from, that part of the green. And again, the AES is particularly concerned with, these are images that people are aware of these from these county fairs, these fitter family contests, trying to make in legible terms what eugenics means and its ideas and logic as it relates to public policy. Madison Grant, a Yale alumni, who then has an appointment at Harvard, is also integral to this, the founding of this project. And Grant's most infamous book is The Passing of the Great Race, which is foundational to the nativist politics that gripped the nation in the early 20th century. I'll just say quickly, the early directors of the American Eugenics Society, and I can just imagine, you know, people on faculty, you know this, right? You're trying to get a project going, and you look around and you think, who can I count on to do some work and to bring into this? And Fisher found, had no lack of, you know, early collaborators. So geography professor Ellsworth Huntington, president of the American Association of Geographers, the dean of the medical school, Milton Winternitz, and several other faculty, as we'll hear again, stepped forward, took the call to join the directorship of the American Eugenics Society. By the 1930s, the AES is moving, really, they're publishing prolific publishing, all kinds of textbooks, journals, really trying to think about meeting. We have all this correspondence that we're just beginning to look through about engaging a broad cross-section of society. This is a textbook that Huntington authors, Tomorrow's Children, The Goal of Eugenics. And this is in the mid-1930s, as the AES in particular and Yale faculty are turning much more to what was now called negative eugenics, the notion of, you know, achieved through sterilization, other forms of reproductive regulation to weed out the reproduction of allegedly harmful genetic traits. So this just gives you some sense of the kind of, again, the point of entry and the depth. And I'll just say before we, I'm gonna bring on Sydney Velasquez in a moment, who's gonna talk about each of these three figures. I think Sydney's going to talk to us about Irving Fisher, and each of these student researchers is going to present a finding, an artifact from their archival work this summer. And I'll just say very quickly, you know, we talked all summer as we were doing this research, as they were doing this research, about, you know, this project is not simply a project of like ethical prosecution, like we are going to find out the individuals responsible for this so we can isolate and indict them, because indeed that doesn't allow us to see the structures, the genealogies, the patterns of thought and idea that animate this. It isolates it to individuals. And the second thing we said we're not going to do is tell a kind of like teleological story in which we can kind of shake our fingers at these bad historic figures and then comfort ourselves in imagining that our institution, our disciplines, our bodies of knowledge, our curriculum bear no traces of it, but instead to try to think in an open-ended way about how this work continues to, shape and move our worldviews in ways we just, can't even get our heads around. So this is a map that they created of the Yale campus today, and we'll start with Irving Fisher. So Sydney, can we bring you on here?
Sure, absolutely. I think we wanted to start with all of our introductions first, and then I'll get into my piece. So I will give you guys my introduction. I'm Sydney. I use she, they pronouns. I'm a student here at Yale. I am a sophomore, and I'm an American Studies major. I'm originally from Los Angeles, California.
Thank you so much, Sydney. And then, Dora, welcome.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dora. I use she, her pronouns. Thank you, Sydney, for having us all do our intros. I'm originally from Illinois, and I am an ethnicity, race, and migration major at Yale University.
Hi everyone, my name is Jose. I use he and pronouns. I'm from Orlando, Florida. I'm a senior at Yale, and I also study ethnicity, race, and migration.
Fantastic. Thanks. Welcome. Dora, before we turn over to Sydney, can you just tell us about what we're looking at here in terms of this map?
Yes, so the darker gray blocks are Yale's campus. In the lower left is the medical school campus, where the Institute of Psychology was originally located. The American Eugenics Society was at one point on Yale's campus, located just a few blocks away from the president's office, which to us was very significant in terms of what you're choosing as an administrator or as a creator of an educational space of Yale to position closest and to prioritize to the president.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Dora. So we're going to come back to, I think we're going to start with Sydney, go to Dora, and then come back to Jose. And I'll just say, Sydney's going to talk to us about an artifact in Irving Fisher's archive. And I'll say, we actually talked and deliberately decided to try to find artifacts that reflected in some ways the kind of much more like quotidian, everyday ways that eugenics was circulating throughout the teaching, research, and kind of social life of the university, rather than, I don't know, the kind of smoking gun or most damning piece. So Sydney, tell us just a little bit about Fisher, and then we'll look at the document you selected for us.
Absolutely. So as some of you may know, Irving Fisher was a renowned economist and Yale professor from 1898 to 1935. After surviving his own personal battle with tuberculosis, he became a champion of personal hygiene and public health at the turn of the 20th century. So Fisher saw eugenics as the next logical step in public health. He believed it to be sort of the crux of what public health needed. He said eugenics is the hygiene raised to the highest power. Because of Fisher's power in both policy and his economic standing, he uses academic influence in economics and researches at Yale to promote social hygiene policy and eugenics ideology through local and national health campaigns. In 1911, Congress began to fund eugenics studies as a result of Fisher's rigorous promoting. Similarly, in 1926, the American Eugenics Society was established, as Professor Hosing mentioned, at Fisher's proposal. Excuse me. To provide evidence for eugenics claims, Fisher tapped into his skill set in mathematics. He conducted lots of research collecting populations, amassing hereditary details for those he perceived to be second-class citizens, which were feeble-minded, insane, criminals, epileptics, inebriates, diseased, blind, deaf, and deformed, and dependent classes. Through such research, Fisher conducted the forcible sterilization, segregation, and anti-miscegenation laws and anti-immigration policy that would curb reproduction of unfit populations. And the particular archival piece that I will be showing you guys is essentially a letter that he wrote promoting these or establishing the federalization of this eugenics policy. So as you can see here, it's highlighted. I will read the excerpt for you and then I'll detail it a little bit. So the excerpt says, many members of the committee feel strongly that the health of the nation is quite as important as any of the fields now coveted by the cabinet departments, and that therefore we should aim ultimately at least at the establishment of a department within a cabinet officer at its head, even if for policy's sake we should strive first for a halfway measure. And essentially what this letter is, to provide some context, is that he was writing a letter to one of his colleagues, William Eliot, sort of about his anticipation of creating a cabinet position for a Department of Health within the federal president's cabinet. He had several other correspondences between him and the president at the time, President Roosevelt, but this sort of demonstrates the emphatic nature with which Fisher viewed this importance of federalizing his eugenics propaganda. The committee that he had sort of assembled, called the Committee of the 100, was for the purposes of guising his eugenics as a public health concern, and he prioritized institutionalizing these beliefs on that federal level. The various letters between him, President Roosevelt, and his other colleagues further ratified that Fisher was very eager and did not really have much shame about his intentions. In these letters, he's not sort of, he's disclosing that the purposes of this federal committee that he's established was for the purposes of spreading this eugenics propaganda, as opposed to the public health with which he guised this belief. And that is basically it.
Thanks, Sydney, for taking us through this. I mean, a couple of things. I mean, one is to remember, like, Fisher is still a very, I mean, some people call him the most celebrated, member of the economics faculty in the history of a, highly regarded department. So he's not a minor figure. And I think other things, Sydney, that I really learned from this is, there was a vision at one point to really put eugenics at the center. This is the progressive age, at the center of an enlarging federal government to essentially help it constitute. And what I'm really struck by, Sydney, is that, right, like, this doesn't succeed, right? Ultimately, Fisher's efforts are rebuffed, so that there we can see them like thinking about how it is that they're going to try to realize and implement a eugenics agenda, and then how the university then becomes such an important site. Right, the university in many ways absorbs the eugenics agenda that the federal government itself wouldn't take on. So thanks, Sydney. We'll come back to you after we hear from Dora and Jose, so we can just think together for a little bit about the insights from this project, but appreciate getting us started this way. Okay, Dora, Robert Yerkes, we've heard a little bit about before. Can you just introduce him to us and then share the artifact we're going to look at?
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor. So Robert Yerkes was a professor of psychobiology at Yale from 1925 to 1941. He was also a lifelong member of the American Eugenics Society. As a psychologist, he is best known for creating the first group intelligence tests during World War I. And Yerkes' Army testing program, these IQ tests, provided vast amounts of data to statistically prove the existence of racial hierarchies. His tests were instrumental to the growing acceptance of intelligence as a marker of not just like people's cognitive capacities, but also their moral worth and their human value. IQ tests, or intelligence testing more broadly, over the course of the 20th century was utilized to control immigration at Ellis Island, to patrol the US-Mexican border, to justify the compulsory sterilizations of people in prisons and in asylums, and to define the exclusionary boundaries of the college entrance process itself to institutions like Yale. As a professor at Yale, Yerkes integrated some of his external research projects from the National Research Council into the Yale Institute of Psychology. And these projects were eugenics oriented, especially the ones pulling from such committees as the scientific problems of human migration and research in problems of sex. The archive I want to pull at today is a letter from December 2nd, 1930. It's written by Yerkes and it's addressed to his really good friend and a fellow eugenicist, Charles Gold, who he refers to as Carlos. So like Sydney did, I'm just going to read the highlighted excerpts. Yerkes is recommending a book to his friend Charles as a Christmas gift. And the book is about Charles W. Eliot, who is the Harvard president. And the quote says that Charles W. Eliot was a great believer in stocks, meaning racial stocks. I've quoted from The Life of Harvard's Great President by Henry James. I should love to send them the books as a Christmas present. And he goes on to tell his friend, you've always reminded me of Mr. Eliot. And, if you don't take that as a compliment, maybe because you think Yale is a rival, I'm sure that reading these books would change your mind. And the reason I wanted to put this letter and this like intimate correspondence as opposed to something more, I guess, indicting of his exact agenda is because the lines of intimate correspondence revealed like how eugenics and the violence of that ideology was often hidden in plain sight. Of course, this ideology requires structures of power and processes of hegemony to establish itself, but I think eugenics also requires the intimate and the quotidian in order to legitimate itself. people don't have to exchange stories about gravity, which is what Professor Hosing was telling me, because gravity is axiomatic. It's understood to be true. But people do need to share stories and books and inside jokes about other forms of power and of understanding their relationship as the people in power and in positions to exclude others. And this was really meaningful for me to engage with in opposition to a lot of the other documents we had been looking at over the summer.
Thanks. I just so appreciate like the careful detail, Dora, to these moments. And, you know, it just makes me also, you know, it's like helpful to remind ourselves what's happening in 1930, right? The city of New Haven, it's no longer a kind of like Anglo-Saxon outpost, you know, for elite education. It's now teeming and animated with Black folks from the South who come during the Great Migration and establish themselves all over the city, immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. There's challenges to the regime of Jim Crow. And the fact that you're calling our attention that he's, you know, these forms of authority are being subtly contested to a story about stocks, right? And their status. And, you know, when I read this, it made me think of my colleague at Yale in history, David Blight, talking about 30 years earlier at the start of the kind of redemption period, the way Southerners really used that moment to also generate stories about Civil War heroes, not because they had a, you know, a particular presence in their life, but because it spoke to the social vision that they're trying to assert. And so I think something here about these, you know, elite researchers exchanging stories at this, you know, tumultuous moment about stocks really gives us insight into this as in some ways like a almost like a counter kind of process or move to all that was happening there. So thanks, Dora. We're gonna again come back to you and also ask you to talk about these the maps as well. And this is just, you know, very much the tip of Yerke's ongoing influence in projects like this. Okay, and lastly, just for the first part, Jose, can you tell us about who we're going to learn about next?
Yeah, so our last figure is Yale president during the period that we studied most throughout our summer research. So we have President James Rowland Ongle. Ongle was president from 1921 until 1927. And during his 16-year tenure, Yale received astronomical donations from two alums, Edward Harkness and the late John Sterling. They received about $2 million in 1921, which today is equivalent to about $27 million in donations. And these donations helped transform Yale from a college to a university. And Ongle's presidency really helped usher the college's founding into its largest expansion. The School of Nursing was created at this time, the School of Medicine was greatly expanded, and we start to see the university exist in new spaces in New Haven that elsewhere had not been seen. And at the same time that the university is opening itself up, we start to also see that it's profoundly self-constricting who is capable of committing this work, who is able to be a part of the university and of the Yale figure. And Ongle is instrumental into defining that role. And he helps bring the American Eugenics Society to New Haven, where it remains stationed for about 18 years. And he's also instrumental in inviting faculty like Yerkes and Fisher, that Dora and Sydney had discussed earlier, among other eugenicists who would play an instrumental role on campus relations. Yeah, and we can go on to the document. So the document that we wanted to talk about reflects that Ongle was a chief architect of eugenics at Yale, but the significance of his legacy doesn't lie in his position as president. And the more accurate and more rigorous productive framework for us in engaging this legacy and reckoning with it is to see that the institution, as it was founded as an elite white Anglo-Saxon Protestant university, aided and abetted by systems of oppression that were instrumental and existed because its founders owned enslaved persons and stole indigenous lands and always stood to gain from the logics of eugenics, a logic that sought to limit the confines of who is capable. And this document speaks to that and those limits of capability. Ongle was a member and trustee of the General Education Board, and this document is a reflection of meeting minutes from one of their sessions on March 14, 1932. The board articulated a vision of education that stated that training for the advancement of knowledge required, quote, a selection of those having exceptional ability. Ongle was trained in social Darwinism, He conceived of intelligence as unevenly distributed between those with exceptional abilities and others. He believed that educational opportunities should be stratified in response to those conditions, and that the General Education Board should deny higher education opportunities to those who did not meet their criteria. And those often fell very harshly along gendered, racial, and class lines. And Yale likewise is building itself up in this same vision in this same moment. The culture of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants is the one that Yale truly centers itself around when it decides which leaders are capable of carrying its mission of research and scholarship and of education around the globe. And we start to see that eugenics becomes another strategy for the university to cement its borders, to maintain and justify exclusion. Eugenics at Yale ultimately is the assumption that people who are better bred are better situated to control educational resources, to define entrance to society, and to ultimately exclude and exploit. And this is why even when Angell leaves Yale in 1939, we have a new generation of leaders that continue to espouse this same vision of education by selecting those who only have the capacity. And although he leaves Yale right before another period in its history, the legacies of this thinking continue to permeate throughout the university's functioning and to define who it allows into its borders. And the tree graphic that we opened up with today is a demonstration of that. I think we also have another one on the next slide. Yeah. So this is the graphic we opened up with. And we superimpose this with the university in the background and the tree kind of branching out in the foreground. And we also put this image overlaid with other figures across the university, some that we discussed today, like Yerkes and Fisher, but we also include others that Professor Hosing mentioned in the beginning, like Ellsworth Huntington, Winternitz, but other great figures around Yale, which include the Forestry School, Pichot, and we also include anthropologists like Clark Whistler. And this all just goes to show that Angell served one role in inviting prominent figures to the university space, but that their functioning of eugenic scholarship existed only in their collaboration, right? This interdisciplinary nature that they really advance served to amplify the university's limited view of education, one that should be limited. And it's a legacy that still exists today, very much so, and how the university and higher education overall approaches admission processes. So it's worth noting that their limited vision for what education can mean still permeates the university and controls much of our own visions of what's possible today.
Thanks, Jose. This is just such a striking, it's kind of unwieldy in some ways for us to get our head around because of so much, but I think it also speaks to the kind of breadth, right, of this work. And I'll just say quickly before I ask you each for a very quick closing comment, I think I'll say this is a really important point, even as Yale tells its own history. This period in the 20s and 30s, this is the growth of the research university from something that's actually a little more provincial and focused, admittedly on a narrow form of elite education into an aspiration to be the institution that many people understand today, something like a world-class research institution. And at its core, you have Angell saying, yes, we're opening up to the world, but we want to be very, very clear about who we understand to be capable of producing that knowledge. And in that sense, they drew on, if we talk about roots, a deeply provincial sense of where knowledge comes from, about where the legitimate sites of knowledge. And I think it's a very important provocation you're giving us, Jose, to think about those legacies today in a wide range of ways. So thanks so much for sharing this work. And I also want to just quickly acknowledge Tallulah Keeley-LeClaire and Emily Hsu, the two other student members of the research team who produced this great work, and that it's just at the start. Could I just turn back to you very quickly? Let's just do Sydney, Dora, and Jose. After spending, some time in the archive summer, just again scratching the surface, an insight you came away with, or a question that remained, just for about a minute each. So Sydney, can we start with you?
Sure, absolutely. So for me, having spent this summer, I had just come back from Spain. And so I was thinking a lot about the way that colonial powers affect sort of our modern lives and the intricacies that, that these existing institutions have on my day-to-day life. And I think that doing this research really solidified that for me, you can live within these institutions while also hoping to make that type of difference. I found it really fascinating that both me and Fisher are completing our research and doing our work at the same institution. And I think that it sort of gave me the hope and the aspiration that an institution with as much resource and as much power as Yale, that even though this is our history, that we can sort of move forward and go with intentionality and, with a lot of care and empathy as we endeavor on the rest of our academic and the rest of our career.
Thank you, Sydney. I so appreciate the way you've complicated that. This is the institution we inherit. It structures our learning, the curriculum, and at the same time we can aspire to a way of understanding knowledge production much different. And I'll just say quickly, because there was a question to us about kind of all of our background in this. This is not actually my direct area of research. I've taught a little about this, so this was a kind of process of discovery for all of us in kind of learning about this. And aside from a couple of very short pieces and the alumni magazine and the newspaper and a wonderful undergraduate thesis, very little published about this. Can we turn now to you, Dora? Biggest insight or a question that remains?
Absolutely. I think throughout the summer, our whole team kept asking ourselves how we could make our work oriented to face the people who this history affects most directly. It was a question that both motivated us and haunted us, I think. And in thinking about, how do we invite others to learn alongside us as we uncover histories of eugenics at Yale? How do we leave questions open? I think I'm just very appreciative of the fact that our panel today includes student researchers and includes voices of young people who are looking into these histories, if only to acknowledge that forms of knowledge exist outside of professors, outside of only researchers, and that there are different sorts of communities, even beyond us as students at Yale. That's already a limitation. And how can we, I think the question with me is, how can we engage the city of New Haven, residents of New Haven, as Yale has always implicated the city in its work?
Thank you, Dora. And it's just, yes, also there's so much in the archive about idea, here's where we can test it out, here's where we can, right there, they're so aware of that relationship. Okay, and just to close us off, Jose, last reflections here.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest takeaways from doing this research is to understand how much of a casualty eugenics played in this time period, but how that casualty still remains part of the university today and the university that we inherit. And at the same time that we think about that casualty and having it limit who is deserving, who is not, who is capable, and who is incapable, it also opens and invites a conversation about new ways that we can be together. And I found that to be really motivating in our work, to consider more possibilities for your futures that are led in community and against this ideology, and that there is a way to contest it, but it involves overturning those barriers of incapability that eugenicists tried to promote.
Great. Okay, I'm going to stop this now. I'm so grateful for all of you. Thanks for this great work. This is just the beginning for us, and we look forward with our colleagues to continuing to raise all those wonderful questions. So thanks to you all. Appreciate it.
Wow, thank you, Professor Hossain. Thank you so much also for bringing your students into this and for showing us they too are knowledge producers. We've learned so much from them in this last half hour. Thank you. Okay, so now we are moving into our last half hour, which will be a discussion among some people from each of the sessions today, and that will be moderated by Nora Grossi. So I think we need to just gather those folks on screen at this point. Nora, who you've already met from University College of London, anthropologist, and did work with Martha's Vineyard in global disabilities issues.
Oh, excellent. Let me introduce the panelists here. We're pleased that we're being joined by Judy Dow, Nancy Gallagher, Brian Greenwald, Suzanne Beelder, and Daniel Hosang, I hope I pronounced your name right, Daniel. We're asked to do something rather difficult, which is to come up with concluding remarks and to pull together a lot of the ideas that have been raised over the past few hours. And the discussion, frankly, has been so rich that we could go in any number of directions. Let me ask, maybe start with a few basic questions and throw it out to the panel and then see if we can kind of continue from there. I'll start with, actually, I'll start with 3 questions, but they all interrelate. So why New England? Why does this matter? And how are we, what is remembered and what is not remembered when we go through the histories like this? What do we choose to remember? What do we either choose to forget, or what ideas are edged out or somehow become part of the common discourse, but we really have lost the thread of where they're coming from? How are these related? I'll please just raise your hand if you and unmute your mics. Suzanne, please.
Yeah, I'm just in awe of all of these panels. And I'd simply start, let me correct the pronunciation of my husband's name, which is Blier. And I want to do that with intent because he is French Canadian background. His father had 18 in his family, and his family to this day refused to come to Cambridge because of the events around the Revolutionary War and Oliver Cromwell and the forcing out of the Acadians from Nova Scotia and going inland and purportedly living for generations in that broader area. So when we think about the legacy and the history passed down generation to generation, and I can assure you our daughter knows this story as well, it's just so complex. And I love what Professor Hosang was talking about with Yale in the 30s as a bulking up period of what we would become. We can see the same thing here in our residence halls. And that's also the key moment of the Civil War monuments, right, around the country, to a legacy of promoting a failure into a success. And so I think all of these things are so interconnected.
Thank you, Suzanne. Oh, yes, please. Judy?
Or Judy, which?
Go ahead.
Oh,
well, the thing that I have seen most is, and Judy and I, we were both teachers in Vermont schools. And a lot of my students came from families like Judy's, and I saw the prejudices that developed and were exacerbated through the eugenics movement. And the language was still very much alive and well in the schools where I taught. The kids and the families were still often marginalized and denigrated, or automatically assumed to need special education or this, when in fact, a lot of this was what we call transgenerational trauma. And looking back on my memories of these families and kids, I can see that now, knowing where it came from. And I think that's why it's important to remember eugenics. Moreover, many of the families who were affected and read my books, they were validated. They felt a sense of, oh, now we know where some of this came from. So.
And I'd like to answer why New England. Suzanne Blier mentioned her husband came from a family of 18. The majority of the Vermont eugenics records are French Canadians, and part because during this period of time, Canada, or in 1890 actually, Canada had a law called La Loi des Enfants, the law of 12 children. And it was expected that every family have 12 children at least. They be baptized and produce one nun and one priest, and that they will get 100 acres of land if they did that. If they had 24 children, they got 200 acres. If they had 36 children, they got 300 acres. By 1895, they had given away 500,000 acres, and they were concerned about giving away more land. So they amended the law, changed it to $100. And back then that was 10,900. So if you have a family of 12 or 16 or 18, whatever, you couldn't survive with that land. So they moved down here to the mills. They worked in the mills in Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, all the way down in Providence. And it was that explosion in the mills and the explosion of Francos that caused an uncontrollable fear for these people. And here in Vermont, they started creating all these social welfare laws, making, schooling mandatory and things like that. And along comes the next generation called the Revenge of the Cradle. And in the Revenge of the Cradle, all those big, large families had 12, 13, 15, whatever. My mother from a family of 16, my father from a family of 12. And so all of these Francos and French Indian people were becoming a reason for concern. And so the social welfare laws continue to grow, and the fears continue to grow with the Revenge of the Cradle generation, and hence the eugenics laws in Vermont.
Very interesting. Thank you both. Would someone else like to join the conversation?
Sure, I'll just jump in. I so appreciate those comments. Just to say two things quickly. I mean, one, there's certainly something about kind of New England's role in the national imaginary and the like longstanding challenges to situate the region in all of its complexity. So as a profound benefactor and originator of the transatlantic slave trade and the slavery economy, of the kind of original site of settler colonialism and its logics of militarism and dispossession. And those things are often kind of they're cast out there, but so it's ongoing work always to imagine that it's not just it happened here too, but it in many ways happened here first. The second thing is we often talked in this project about there's this narrative like this is regrettable, but it was a sign of the times. It was kind of in the milieu. They didn't know any better. And as I was reading this Ellsworth Huntington, Tomorrow's Children piece, that it forms an intellectual framework for compulsory sterilization, in effect. It's the same year that W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction comes out. Du Bois is educated at Harvard, and the whole premise of that piece, of course, is about, the kind of how these histories of white supremacy and racial domination are, he has this wonderful line about they're not worthy of grown folk. This is something that we should have gotten rid of a long time ago. So it's a much more capacious sense of knowledge that's also circulating. You saw first an early generation of Black psychologists challenging those IQ tests and saying they don't measure anything, they measure cultural knowledge. So these things were contested all the time. There was, social movements challenging Jim Crow and lynching and others. So this notion of they just didn't know, this kind of disavowal, this effort to kind of render innocent, doesn't actually contend with that. There were other alternatives that were formidable. And of course, the long indigenous presence in the region that had constantly challenged this is inevitable. So I just want to say that it's something that it sometimes doesn't come as easily to us, I think, in these institutions, but it's important to bear in mind.
Right. Thank you. Very interesting comments. I was going to ask Brian, but I see he has his hand up already about comparable issues in the deaf community. Please, Brian, go ahead.
Yes, why New England? Really, the New England area
hello?
Yes, in the New England area was the root of the American deaf community, with the first school for the deaf being established and schools growing, and also A.G. Bell. He was in the New England area. And with the deaf community back then and now, A.G. Bell represents a kind of trauma. So Americans, we know about Bell as an American hero, someone who invented the telephone. He educated the deaf. So that's a positive image. But within the deaf community, the culturally signing deaf community, A.G. Bell is a complete opposite. It's a very negative view on his attempt to actually remove and ban sign language, and his intention to reduce deaf marriage in deaf populations. So Bell's role within the eugenics movement is complicated. And as many of the presenters have said today, we see a lot of the same names, like the president of Harvard and various institutions. And Bell, what was interesting is those people would convene in Cold Spring Harbor, New York, and they'd have meetings there with the eugenics movement. And there were very committees on genetic diseases. Feeble-mindedness, blindness, all these different things, but all the committees with the 6 members were all experts per se. And Bell invited the chair of the deaf mute group. Oh, deaf was, excuse me, that was an interpreter error. A.G. Bell was the only one in deaf mutism, whereas the other groups had more members in it. So Bell actually became the barrier, and he had a negative approach with not allowing marriage and sterilization within the deaf community. On the other hand, that trauma exists still, his forbidding sign language usage. And that was all centered in New England. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for that excellent slide that's up now. It really illustrates who was involved and how there were connections between all these groups in a time that when in the from the late 19th century through about the 1930s, when this was also when Yale and Harvard were also at the forefront of, along with many other institutions, with promoting these ideas and giving a certain gravitas to new kind of ideas that we are still grappling with today, as Brian points out. Michael, would you like to add as well?
Yeah, certainly would. I just find the presentations today have been enormously stimulating, and for me, and I'm sure for everyone who's participating or listening to our presentations today. I just wanted to add that for me, as someone who does modern German history with a focus on the Nazi Holocaust, the history of eugenics is really a warning from history. Brian put that slide up just a moment ago. It was utterly extraordinary when you see the names on the list. These are not marginal people, right? These aren't crackpots or, on the lunatic fringe of American society. They're connected to some of the leading educational institutions in the world at that time and today as well. And I can't help but think of the research and writing that I've done in the field of Holocaust studies and its post-war prosecution. And you could find similar slides, I'm sure, of the leading eugenicists in Germany. Of course, they called it racial hygiene. It was specifically tied to race and racism, but it was in fact eugenics. It was the German appropriation of eugenics. But if you found a similar slide for the luminaries of the eugenics movement in Germany, it would be very similar to what Brian just showed. Leading figures, some of the preeminent intellectuals, including Nobel laureates who were espousing these ideas. What eugenics demonstrates to us is how pseudoscience can achieve such a powerful traction within our society. and how it maps so neatly onto social prejudice. And I think many of us, including those of us, most of us on this panel, who are in the universities, I think would find ourselves challenged even today by a majority of scholars who would endorse such ideas. I mean, when you have figures of this magnitude and of this power backing these sorts of notions, I think it's very difficult for people to criticize them, right? If it's some marginal figure on talk radio, that's one thing, but when you have the leading scholars within a society throwing the weight of their supposed wisdom and learning behind it, then it's a challenge for the rest of us to stand athwart that and to resist it. But of course, that's what we have to do, right? As people who are committed to the truth and to advancing humanity and compassion in society.
Thank you, Michael. Very important points. Does anybody want to respond to what Michael said?
Well, I agree completely, and that's where things are so difficult in a way, and so absolutely important. And I would come back with a couple of questions and comments. One, in anthropology, it was in part Melville Herskovits, who is Jewish, who is moving against some of the more biased evolutionary theory having to do with Africans, in part because he himself has a stake in it. And so we get the larger issues of cultural identity, Judaism, et cetera, in the play. But one of the things that we haven't talked about here is the role of religion. And I'm thinking about Harvard's early presidents were religious figures. We have an important divinity school here. Yale has an important divinity school. For many reasons, the heart of Protestantism, and I think there's a lot within Protestantism on this, has moved from New England elsewhere. But what I'm missing now that I saw a little bit more of in the 60s is kind of pushback within that religious moral background. And I think that that's a really important piece of this, because it's religion, after all, that requires the belief of many things that are irrational. You know, the virginity of Mary. I mean, all of these things, it may be true, I don't know, but it is using that kind of framework to promote values and fear that are highly successful in elections and on things such as Facebook, et cetera, that is promoting this. And so we're seeing this being played out like wave after wave after wave, including just recently on the Texas border with what was happening with Haiti. In my life, I never expected to see that again. There are lots of things I never expected to see, but I think, you know, we've been in ivory towers a lot, and even in secondary schools, finding ways to get out into the community and transform education and transform the way we begin to think about things at a time when libraries are closing, right? When more and more people are doing homeschooling. And it's a tough road, but it's something we just have to start in on.
Thank you, Suzanne. Nancy.
There's a couple questions on here that deal with the numbers of people who were actually sterilized. Someone said no, more than 700 people. That's actually incorrect. I know New Hampshire had well over 1,000 they reported, as well as Maine. Our numbers look low, but many, as much of the eugenics history has shown, many sterilizations took place in the context of childbirth, or cesarean childbirth, appendectomies and stuff, and there is documentation on all of those. So we don't really know. It may be in Vermont, we think it's probably a lot greater than the number of certificates that institutions put in for eugenics sterilization. And then as far as pseudoscience, I kind of agree with your statement that why do we call it pseudoscience? Because human genetics in early 20th century America and eugenics were synonymous. if you look at the Journal of Heredity, you know, it was this kind of research with an agenda, you know, to supposedly improve the human race. But that's one of the downfalls of humanity, is scientists are people too, and given to their own feelings, prejudices, and whatever. You know, it's a human activity after all. It's not perfect. Go ahead, Judy.
You know, I was going to address the numbers as well. In Vermont, they just barely got the certificate for sterilizations, and they're currently, Vital Statistics Office is currently inputting them into their files. So it's not, again, I agree with Nancy, it's an unknown number for many, many reasons. And so I'm not sure that anybody can validate, you know, hold any particular number as being valid for right now. People are still uncovering this information. And I also want to say too, that the eugenicists of the time believed this to be a true science, believed eugenics to be a true science. It wasn't until many, many decades later it was declared a pseudoscience. So I agree with being concerned about just calling it a pseudoscience now, if you're referring to like decades after when people actually thought it was a true science. So I think there has to be some distinguishing comments between the use of that.
Maybe one of the issues is that it calls on us not just to think about eugenics, but also current science. So what do we take as unbridled or facts that no one questions, approaches that are unquestioned today, and what will they look like a generation hence or 100 years hence? I think it's very easy at the time to be part of a group of scholars or researchers or advocates who buy into and are taught and are brought up and are encouraged to see in one particular focus, and the ability to step back and to rethink and reanalyze is critically important. I don't think we do enough of that in any era with any science, but certainly this is a model when it comes to eugenics of how you can have some of the leading people in some of the leading universities in the world, and still go terribly off the tracks. Having said that, I should also say it's of interest to me, and I'm particularly glad we have the Nancy and Judy here from Vermont, because I see there's a range from the presidents of Harvard and Yale through not just the scientists who are working at these institutions or the research that are coming out of it, but a large number of young men and eventually women as well, who go into politics, the media, civil society, not just at these institutions, but at universities all over the world, and who bring these ideas out into the community. So the issue to me is that it's a continuum. It's not just the leading researchers, but how that knowledge filters down to affect people living in Winooski, Vermont, for example. And I think that we often just kind of highlight either the cutting edge research or the people who are ultimately affected, but it impacts the way people think and vote throughout societies, both in the United States and beyond. I'm conscious we're running short of time. Does anybody have want to have a final quick word or two, or final comment among our panel?
I'll just say really quick, Judy. I think it's an open-ended question about what these inheritances are. There's some notion that after these figures leave, like it disappears. And if they're, of course, training students, writing curriculum, setting up institutes, all of that, the architecture for nativism comes from our respective universities. So it's a complicated thing when we look out there at these expressions of nativism and also understand that they originated from us and from within. And I'll say the same, it's very much, there was a comment from Marcy about the Center for Genetics and Society about the deep reckoning we have to do today with many forms of research on the human genome and the way it bears these legacies out. So from my perspective, we're at the start of this work. Identifying these figures is only the opening. Understanding how they shape our world is the work ahead of us.
And the last thing I wanted to say was people need to understand eugenics is alive and well today.
In the mind.
And this is Brian. I wanted to add something too.
Yeah.
Yes. If we can, could Mark quickly show that picture again? Or Matt, I'm sorry, I called you by the wrong name.
My slide.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the 100 years ago, the 1921, the year that the Congress met in New York. And Alexander Graham Bell at that time had sent a bunch of schedules.
Charts.
And they had sent studies and graphs. And it was not about deaf people at all, the information he sent. But Alexander Graham Bell was very much involved in the eugenics movement. And when he sent the data that he sent and the drawings that he sent, oh, here it comes. Okay. Oh, go back a few, the other way.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, that one right there. So I wanted to show you this because I think for me, it's a nice summary of the legacy that still stands today and what it means from the eugenics perspective about controlling marriage. And we see deaf people continuing to marry each other, and that is really sticking it to Alexander Graham Bell. And when we're talking about the past, how people were developing the opposite narrative. So
Excellent.
when we go back to 1921, and we're thinking about that Congress, when Alexander Graham Bell sent out the family tree pedagogy, it was not about the deaf people or anything. It was about long life studies of genes and how they continued and how that would continue to affect people for a long time positively. And we are encouraging that. So the final move, we're finally moving away from the negative approach of eugenics. So I'll keep it short, but I just wanted to show you that graphic.
Thank you, Brian. That's a perfect way to end this session. It falls to me to thank all the members of this panel and to also encourage the viewers to join us again. We concentrated for the most part on eugenics in the past on this panel. On Tuesday, October 19th from 1 to 4 Eastern Standard Time, we will have the second of the three-part series talking about eugenics today. And on November 16th, I'm sorry, the last one was October 19th. And on November 16th, there's also the last of this series of 3 talks on eugenics in the future. And we again invite you all to join us at that time. On behalf of everyone who's participated today, we'd like to thank you for listening. I'd like to thank all the panelists, and we hope you have a good evening, and we look forward to you joining us next time. Thank you all, and have a good afternoon or good evening.